The day Mason Ryder inherited a junkyard, 3 people told him to burn the paperwork. His accountant said the debt would swallow him whole. His brother said their father had lost his mind. And a billionaire woman in a wool coat stood right in the middle of rusted truck frames and told him, point blank, that the land wasn't worth saving. He was 32 years old, broke, raising a son alone, and holding the deed to 4 acres of metal rot and broken dreams. He said no to all of them. This is the story of what happened next. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and follow along to the end. You won't regret it. The lawyer's office smelled like old coffee and carpet that hadn't been replaced since the 90s. Mason Ryder sat in a chair that was slightly too small for him, his jacket still damp from the rain outside, a manila envelope on the table in front of him that he hadn't opened yet. Across the desk, Gerald Holt, a state attorney, 50-something, reading glasses on a chain around his neck, watched Mason with the particular patience of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that his face had simply stopped reacting to it. You want me to go over the numbers again? Gerald asked. No. Mason picked up the envelope, set it back down. I heard you the first time. The property has outstanding liens totaling roughly $218,000. The bank has already filed preliminary foreclosure paperwork. You have, at best, 60 days before that process accelerates beyond the point of practical reversal. I understand. There's also the matter of the back taxes. 14 months unpaid. That's another... I said I understand, Gerald. The room went quiet except for the rain against the single window and the faint sound of a printer running somewhere in the back of the office. Gerald folded his hands on the desk. Not unkindly. Your father was a stubborn man, Mason. I say that with respect. I knew him for 22 years, but the junkyard, it was something he held on to well past the point when it made any financial sense. These last few years especially. He paused. You don't have to hold on to it too. Mason looked at the envelope. His name was typed on the front in a plain font. Mason T. Ryder. His father had always insisted on the middle initial. It's the only T. Ryder in the county, he used to say. Might as well make it official. What happens if I just walk away? Mason asked. The bank takes it, sells the land at auction most likely. The liens get settled from the proceeds. You walk away clean. No personal liability since the debt is attached to the property, not to you directly. Gerald leaned back. You'd lose the land, obviously, but you'd have nothing to carry. Mason nodded slowly. He stared at the envelope. Then he picked it up and put it inside his jacket. I'll be in touch, he said, and stood up. Gerald watched him go. He'd seen that look before, too. The one where a man had already made a decision that everyone around him was going to spend the next several months trying to talk him out of. He reached for his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. The drive from Gallup to the property took 40 minutes on a good day, with the rain turning the back roads into something close to rivers. It was closer to an hour. Mason drove with one hand on the wheel and the radio off. The heat in the truck was working only partially. The driver's side vent blew warm, the passenger side blew cold, and the temperature somewhere in the middle of the cab landed on vaguely uncomfortable. He'd been meaning to get it looked at for 3 months. He'd been meaning to do a lot of things for 3 months. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen on the dash. Ethan. He answered it through the speakers. Hey, Ethan said. His voice still had that particular morning quality even though it was past 2 in the afternoon. The one that made Mason wonder sometimes if his son had been up all night again, chasing some project or another. How'd it go? About how I expected. Which means bad. Which means complicated. Dad? A pause. How bad is complicated? Mason watched the road. A tractor-trailer came the other way, its headlights cutting through the rain, the whole truck rocking slightly in the crosswind. The property's got about $200,000 in debt attached to it, Mason said. Bank's already moving toward foreclosure. Silence on Ethan's end. Then, oh, yeah. So what are you... Ethan stopped, seemed to reconsider the question. Then, more carefully, what are we going to do? And that small correction, we instead of you. was the thing that made Mason's jaw tighten for a second. Not from anger. From something else he didn't have a clean word for. "I'm going to go look at it first," Mason said. "Haven't been out there since the funeral." "You want me to come?" "Not yet. Let me see it on my own first." "Okay." Another pause. "Dad?" "Yeah." "He wouldn't have left it to you if he didn't think you could do something with it." Mason didn't answer that. After a moment, Ethan seemed to realize a response wasn't coming, and he said goodbye, and the call ended, and the only sound was the rain and the wet slap of the wipers. The gate was padlocked. Of course it was. Mason sat in the truck for a moment, looking at it through the windshield. The chain-link fence ran along both sides of the gravel entrance, and beyond it, just visible through the rain and the gray afternoon light, he could see the beginnings of it. The yard. He had the key on the ring Gerald had given him. He got out of the truck and unlocked the gate and pushed it open, rust grinding against rust, and he drove through and stopped and got out again and left it open behind him. He walked. The property was 4 acres, roughly rectangular, sitting back off a 2-lane state road about 6 miles from the Interstate 40 interchange. His father had owned it for 31 years. Long enough that Mason had grown up with the smell of motor oil and metal as a kind of background presence in his childhood, not always in the yard itself, but on his father's clothes, on his hands, on the old work shirts that never quite came clean, no matter how many times they were washed. What he saw now was not what he remembered from childhood. The equipment shed on the north side of the property had lost most of its roof on one end. The metal sheeting buckled and pulled back, one wall leaning in a way that suggested it was one bad windstorm away from going down completely. The office trailer, a double-wide that his father had used for records, tools, and on more than one occasion apparently as a place to sleep, had a cracked window and a door that didn't close all the way. Mason could see a coffee maker on the counter inside through the glass, sitting there like it was waiting for someone to come back. The trucks were everywhere. That was the thing about a junkyard that photographs didn't capture. The sheer weight of it. Not just the number of vehicles, but the physical mass of all that dead metal, arranged in rows that had probably once been organized and had drifted over the years into something closer to chaos. Semi-cabs without engines, flatbeds with their frames twisted, box trucks with their rear doors hanging open, vegetation starting to grow up through the floorboards. A school bus, inexplicably, in the back corner, painted over with gray primer and sitting on 4 flat tires. There was also, he noticed, a newer section, closer to the front, near a gravel apron that widened out beside the entrance. Half a dozen vehicles that didn't look like complete losses. Older, beat up, but not stripped. Some with their engines still in them. Mason crouched down next to the nearest one. A mid-90s flatbed, heavy-duty, the kind of truck that used to run farm freight. He looked under the frame. He reached up and touched the front axle, looked at the brake hardware. "Salvageable," he said out loud, to no one. He stood up, looked around the yard. He could see what his father had been doing in those last couple of years, or trying to do. There was an area near the center of the yard that had been partially cleared, the old wrecks pushed to the edges, the ground graded flat. Someone had started laying gravel. Maybe a quarter of the planned area was done before the project had apparently stopped. A parking area. That's what it was going to be. His father had been trying to build something. He just hadn't had time to finish it. Mason sat on the bumper of the school bus in the back corner and called his accountant. Linda Cho had been doing his taxes for 6 years. She was sharp, she was direct, and she genuinely liked Mason, which was why she didn't pull any punches. "I've been waiting for you to call," she said when she picked up. "The estate stuff." "Yeah." "Walk me through what Gerald told you." He did. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Linda, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "First question, what's your current liquid situation?" "About $11,000 in checking. I've got a small retirement account, maybe $44,000, but pulling from that would cost me the penalty plus income tax, so call it $30,000 after the hit." "And your income?" This was the part he'd been bracing for. "The job at Trail Boss ended last month. The whole logistics division got restructured." "I know." "I'm sorry, that was a solid position." "Yeah, well." He looked at the gray sky. It was. "Mason," Linda's voice shifted slightly. Professional, but not cold. I want to be straight with you. Even if you had $100,000 in cash right now, that wouldn't be enough to carry this property long enough to build anything on it with the debt clock running. You're looking at 60 days, maybe 90, if you can stall the bank with a hardship letter and some partial payments. I know. Selling is the rational move. I know that too. Another pause. But you're not going to sell. I haven't decided anything yet. She made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. Sure you haven't. Let me ask you this then. What do you see out there? Because I know you're out there. I can hear the wind. Mason thought about the graded ground, the started gravel, the flatbed with the solid axle. I see something that was being built, he said, before it stopped. Okay, Linda said. I'll run some scenarios. Don't do anything for a week. Let me look at the numbers. I appreciate it. And Mason, if you find a buyer in the meantime, I'll think about it. You won't, she said, but I appreciate you saying that. So, the buyer came to him before he even listed it. It was 4 days after the visit to Gerald's office. Mason was at the yard again. He'd been out every day, walking the property, making notes in a small spiral notebook, cataloging what was there, what could move, what was too far gone. He had the notebook open on the hood of one of the trucks and was sketching a rough layout of the property when a car came through the gate. It was not the kind of car you saw on state roads near Gallup very often. A black Range Rover, clean in the way that suggested it had been washed within the last 24 hours, the kind of clean that required effort to maintain in this part of the country. A woman got out. She was maybe a few years younger than him, early 30s, he would have guessed. She was dressed in a way that occupied the specific zone between professional and practical. A dark wool coat over clothes that were probably expensive without advertising it, boots that were actually boots and not the fashionable kind. Dark hair pulled back. No visible jewelry except a watch that she glanced at exactly once as she got out of the car. She walked toward him without hesitating, which told him she knew who he was and had come specifically for him. Mason Ryder, she said. That's me. She extended a hand. Her handshake was the kind that had been practiced into reflex. Ava Kensington. I'm sorry about your father. He looked at her. Did you know him? Not personally, but I know the property. She glanced around the yard. Something in her expression was precise and quick. She was assessing things the way he did, he noticed, just arriving at different conclusions. I've had my eye on this land for about 18 months. 18 months, he repeated. My father wasn't interested in selling. No. She said it without any particular emotional weight. He wasn't, but the situation has changed. Mason leaned against the truck. And you heard about that fast. I pay attention to property that interests me. She met his eyes, not hostile, just level. Can I walk the property? He considered it for a moment. Then he gestured toward the yard. Be my guest. She walked carefully but not cautiously. She was watching where she stepped without slowing down, which suggested she was used to job sites and properties that weren't finished. She went all the way to the back, looked at the equipment shed, came back through the center where the partial gravel was laid, stopped at the edge of the cleared area. He was building a parking lot, she said. Looked like it to me. For trucks? She was looking at the road, the entrance, the way the gravel apron widened near the gate. The interchange is 6 miles. Long-haul drivers come off I-40, needing somewhere to park for rest hours. There's no designated commercial vehicle lot between here and Amarillo. I know. She looked at him. But the property has... She paused, recalibrating slightly, and he could see her deciding how direct to be. She decided all the way direct. It has significant structural issues. The shed is a liability, the equipment is 90% non-functional, the debt attached is substantial, the access road needs work, and the timeline before the bank moves forward isn't long enough to build anything meaningful. She said all of this evenly, like she was reading from a checklist she'd prepared beforehand. I want to be honest with you because I think you're smart enough that anything else would be a waste of both our time. This land, in its current state, with its current obligations, is not a viable business opportunity. Mason let her finish. Okay, he said. She seemed to expect more than that. I'm offering to purchase the property. I can close quickly, within 10 days. I'll cover the outstanding liens as part of the deal structure, and I can offer you $80,000 above that on top. He did the math quickly. $80,000 above $218,000. He'd walk away with $80,000 in his pocket, no debt, and the problem gone. What would you build here? He asked. She wasn't expecting that question, just slightly. A logistics staging facility, possibly with truck parking in the first phase. The land and the location have value even if the current assets don't. Right. Mr. Ryder. Mason. Mason. She adjusted. I don't say this to be dismissive of your father's work. What he was building here had the right instinct behind it. The location is genuinely good, but the execution never got off the ground, and the debt has made the runway too short for someone who doesn't know what they're doing, he said. She stopped. That's not what I said. No, but it's what you meant. He said it without any edge. Factual, almost. You're telling me the runway's too short for someone who doesn't already know how to run this kind of operation. That's fair. You're probably right. She looked at him carefully. So you're considering the offer? I'm considering everything, he said. I'll let you know. She looked at him for a moment longer, then reached into her coat pocket and handed him a business card. Clean, matte black, minimal text. Just her name, a phone number, and in small letters at the bottom, Kensington Freight and Logistics. I hope you'll make the practical decision, she said. I appreciate you coming out, he said, and put the card in his shirt pocket. She walked back to the Range Rover, and Mason watched it go back down the access road and out through the open gate. He stood there for a moment. He took the card out and looked at it again. Then he put it back in his pocket and picked up his notebook. He started writing. The conversation with his brother happened 6 days later, over the phone, because Derek Ryder had been living in Phoenix for the last 4 years and couldn't be bothered to make the drive. You actually turned down the offer. Derek's voice had that particular quality it always had when he thought Mason was being an idiot. Not angry, just a very deliberate patience, like he was explaining something to someone who was making it unnecessarily difficult. Mason, she offered you $80,000 clear, on top of wiping the debt. I know what she offered. And you said no. I said I'd let her know. Which means no. You've always said that, and it always means no. Derek let out a short breath. Look, I get it. Dad left it to you. You feel like you owe him something. I understand the emotional side of it, but you have to separate that from the business reality here. I don't know that I do, actually. Mason, Dad was in the middle of building something. I can see it in how the property's laid out. He cleared the ground, started the gravel. He was putting in a truck parking area. He knew the location was good. He also ran out of money, got buried in debt, and died before any of it worked, Derek said. Which is the more relevant part. Mason was quiet for a moment. He was sitting in his kitchen, the apartment he'd been renting for the last 3 years since the divorce. 2 bedrooms, 2nd floor, a view of a parking lot. Ethan's old room had his stuff in it again now that he was back from his year up in Albuquerque. Did Dad ever talk to you about the yard? Mason asked. A pause. Not really. Not in the last couple years. Did he ever ask you for help? Money? Or just advice? Why would he ask me? Derek's voice shifted slightly. Not defensive, but adjacent to it. I don't know anything about running that kind of thing. I'm in real estate, Mason. Commercial leasing. It's different. He left it to me, Mason said. Not you, not split between us. To me. Yes, and I'm trying to help you not destroy yourself trying to carry it. I know. And he did know that. Derek was irritating and dismissive and frequently wrong, but he was not a malicious person. Not then, anyway. I'll keep you in the loop. Please think about the offer, Derek said. I am thinking about everything, Mason said, and that was the end of that call. Well, what he'd been thinking about, specifically, was the flatbed, and 3 other trucks he'd identified in the yard that were in similar condition. Salvageable, with work, without requiring the kind of money he didn't have. There was also a service vehicle, an older heavy-duty pickup with a crane arm for roadside recovery that looked like it might run with a new battery, some work on the hydraulic line, and about 40 hours of attention. He'd spent 2 evenings looking up parts prices. He talked to a mechanic friend of his, Carlos Reyes, who owed him a favor going back 5 years and who agreed to come out and give him an honest assessment. Carlos showed up on a Tuesday morning with his own tools and a thermos of coffee and walked the 4 trucks without saying much for about an hour. "The flatbed's the best of them," he said finally. "Needs a rebuilt fuel system, new rear brake assembly, tires obviously. Call it 3,000 in parts if you're doing most of the labor." "I can do most of the labor." Carlos looked at him sideways. "You sure? I know you can wrench, but this is—" "My dad taught me on trucks like these," Mason said. "I'm sure." Carlos nodded slowly. "The recovery pickup is actually not bad. The crane arm is sound. Hydraulic line needs replacing. The pump seal's gone, and it needs a full service. 2,000 in parts, maybe less if you can source some of it secondhand." He drank some of his coffee. "The other 2 are longer shots. Not impossible, but longer. So 4 to 5,000 in parts for all 4 vehicles, plus labor. Something like that. What are you thinking?" Mason looked at the road, the state road that ran in front of the property, and beyond it, in his mind, the 6 miles to the I-40 interchange. Roadside assistance, recovery, truck parking, emergency services for long-haul drivers. Carlos considered that. "You've got no crew." "I've got Ethan. Ethan's 20. He's also better with his hands than most 30-year-olds I know, and he works until something's done." Carlos turned and looked at the partial gravel area near the front of the property. "You'd need to finish that at minimum. Give guys somewhere to actually park." "I know." "The shed needs at minimum a temporary patch on the roof, or it's going to collapse on something important." "I know." Carlos scratched the back of his neck. "You're not asking my opinion on the business plan, are you? You're asking if the trucks are fixable." "That's right." He finished his coffee. "They're fixable," he said. Bam. Mason sold his personal vehicle on a Thursday. It was a 3-year-old pickup, his daily driver, reliable, paid off. He'd bought it when the job at Trail Boss was going well. A private buyer paid him $9,400 for it, cash, in the parking lot of a gas station in Gallup. He took the money to the bank, deposited it, and then he called Linda. "I want you to run the numbers one more time," he said. "Not whether it works. I know you don't think it works. I need to know what the minimum viable version looks like." She was quiet for a moment. "You sold the truck." "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Okay." He could hear her shifting into a different mode, not cheerful, but focused. "Walk me through what you're planning." He did, all of it. The 4 vehicles, the parking area, the emergency roadside service, the repair center concept that could come later if the first phase held. He walked through his rough estimates on parts, labor, potential revenue from parking fees and service calls. She asked questions, hard ones, the kind that required actual answers rather than optimism. He had most of them. The ones he didn't, he admitted he didn't. At the end, she was quiet for about 30 seconds. "Here's what I'll say," she said. "The math is not impossible. It's very tight, and it requires almost everything to go right in the first 90 days, which things rarely do, but it's not impossible." She paused. "You know you're going to have to put in the kind of hours that are going to be brutal, right? There's no version of this where it's manageable from the beginning." "I'm not looking for manageable." "Okay." She seemed to accept that. "And Ethan's actually committed to this? Because I know he's your son, and I know you love him, but I've met Ethan, and he's 20 years old, and 20-year-olds change their minds." "He won't." "You're sure?" "He's more stubborn than I am," Mason said. "And I'm pretty damn stubborn." Linda actually laughed at that, a short, real sound. "Yes, you are." She paused. "You know you're still going to have to deal with the bank timeline. Even if everything works perfectly in the first phase, 90 days is not enough to generate the kind of revenue that services 200 grand in debt. I know, I'm going to call them, try to negotiate a deferment or a restructure, show them there's an active operation." "That might work. Banks don't love foreclosures, they're expensive." "That's what I'm counting on." "Mason," she said, "one more question." "Yeah. If this doesn't work, if in 90 days it's clear that it's not generating what you need, are you prepared to cut your losses then?" He looked at the notebook on the kitchen table, 3 weeks of notes and rough drawings and parts lists and math. "Ask me again in 90 days, he said. He told Ethan that night. His son was at the kitchen table eating a bowl of cereal at 8:30 in the evening, which was classic Ethan. He'd been like that since he was 12, keeping hours that had no particular logic but seemed to work for him somehow. He looked up when Mason sat down across from him with 2 cups of coffee. "You went to the bank?" Ethan asked. "Called them. Got a meeting next week." Mason pushed one of the cups across. "I also called Linda, and Carlos came and looked at the trucks." Ethan set his spoon down. He was listening the way he did when something was serious. Not tense exactly, just still. "Here's where we are," Mason said, and he laid it out. All of it. The debt. The timeline. What he'd sold the truck for. What the parts would cost. What they'd need to build, and fix, and operate, and how long they had before the math had to start working. Ethan listened without interrupting. When Mason finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "Okay," he said. "Ethan, I need you to actually—" I said, "Okay, Dad." Not defensive, just clear. "I heard everything you said. I know what it means. I'm in. It's going to be hard. I know it's going to be hard." He looked up. "You think I don't know that?" Mason looked at his son. 20 years old, still had the same eyes he'd had as a 6-year-old sitting on the tailgate of a truck, watching Mason fix something, patient and attentive, the kind of quiet that wasn't passivity, but focus. "Your grandfather started that gravel," Mason said. "He was partway through something." Ethan nodded. "I know. I want to finish it." "Then let's finish it." They sat there for a while with the coffee going cold between them, and neither of them said anything else because there wasn't really anything else to say. The first day of real work started at 5:30 in the morning, a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Mason had sat in Gerald Holt's office and not opened the envelope. He and Ethan drove out together in a borrowed truck, an old single cab belonging to Carlos's brother, rattling and slow but functional, and got to the property as the sky was still turning from black to gray. They'd picked up a load of gravel the previous afternoon, and it was sitting near the gate, needing to be moved. Mason unlocked the equipment shed and found the old skid loader his father had left, half buried under a tarp and a stack of tires. It took 40 minutes to get it started. The hydraulics were slow, and the left lever was stiff, but it ran. Ethan pulled the tires off the pile and found 2 old sawhorses underneath. He set them up near the flatbed, then went and got the toolbox out of the borrowed truck. "Where do you want to start?" he asked. Mason stood at the edge of the partially graded area, looking at the property. The gray morning light made everything flat, the piles of old vehicles along the edges, the started gravel near the front, the mountains distant against the sky. He thought about Ava Kensington standing in this same spot, looking at the same view, and arriving at the conclusion that it was finished. He thought about his father, out here in the cold, running a skid loader alone, moving dirt, laying gravel, trying to build something he didn't have time to finish. "Fuel system on the flatbed," Mason said. "I'll get the parts list and you pull the tank. Let's see what we're actually dealing with." Ethan nodded and picked up a wrench. They got to work. The yard was cold and gray and smelled like iron and old oil, and there was about 4 acres of problems in every direction, and the bank had a meeting scheduled for next Tuesday, and $200,000 in debt was sitting like a stone at the center of everything. And Mason Ryder was 32 years old and broke, and he had no car and no job, and a son who had just handed him his future without a second thought, and he did not know if any of this was going to work. But he knew how to fix a fuel system. He knew how to grade gravel and patch metal roofing and rebuild a hydraulic pump and pour a concrete footing. He knew these things because his father had taught him, out in yards like this one, through years of cold mornings and grease on his hands, and the particular satisfaction of something that was broken becoming, through effort and patience and stubbornness, something that worked. He picked up a wrench. He got to work. The flatbed took 11 days to get running. The recovery pickup took 9. The gravel apron near the front gate was finished by the end of the 3rd week. On the last day of that week, the first truck came off the state road and pulled into the lot, a long-haul driver looking for somewhere to rest his hours. And Mason took his $12 cash and gave him a receipt written by hand on a notepad he bought at a gas station, and stood there watching the driver climb into his cab for a few hours of sleep. He went inside the trailer and made a note in his ledger. Day 21, first revenue, $12. He looked at the number. It was the most real money he'd made since the inheritance. $12. Mason stared at that number in the ledger for longer than made sense. It was written in his own handwriting, slightly uneven because he'd been cold and his fingers hadn't fully warmed up yet, on the third line of a spiral notebook he'd bought for $1.49 at the gas station on Route 9. The first two lines were the date and the mileage on the borrowed truck. $12. He closed the notebook and set it on the counter of the trailer and stood there in the thin morning light coming through the cracked window, listening to the distant sound of the long-haul driver's rig idling out in the lot. The man had paid without complaint, pocketed his handwritten receipt, and climbed into his cab without another word. He hadn't asked questions about the property or the operation, or whether Mason knew what he was doing. He'd just needed somewhere safe to stop, and the lot was flat, and the gate was open, and there was a light on in the trailer. That was it. That was the whole transaction. Mason poured himself a cup of coffee from the machine on the counter, the same machine that had been sitting there when he first walked into the trailer, which had turned out to still be functional, which he had taken as a small and probably meaningless sign, and sat down on the metal folding chair that served as the office furniture and looked at the $12 in the petty cash box. The debt was $218,000. He drank his coffee. Outside, Ethan was already at the flatbed, finishing the last connections on the rebuilt fuel system. Mason could hear the occasional clank of a wrench, and once, a short burst of what might have been cursing or might have been Ethan talking to himself. It was hard to tell the difference sometimes. His son had a habit of narrating problems out loud, not complaining exactly, just thinking through the obstacle at a volume that other people could hear. It was something Mason's father used to do too. Mason had never pointed that out to Ethan. Some things were better left as quiet continuities. The bank meeting had gone the way bank meetings generally went when you walked in with debt on one side and a handwritten business plan on the other. The loan officer, a careful, deliberate man named Patterson, who wore the same expression through the entire 40-minute conversation, had listened to Mason's presentation with the polite attention of someone who had already made up his mind and was simply being professional about it. "Mr. Ryder," he'd said at the end, "what you're describing is a viable concept in theory. The location does have logistical merit, but the timeline you're proposing for revenue generation doesn't align with the current delinquency status of the account." "I'm asking for a 90-day deferment," Mason had said. "Not forgiveness, just time. A deferment of this duration on a debt of this size with no current income documentation and no operating history. The operating history starts this week." Patterson had looked at him over the desk. Not unkind, just measured. "Mr. Ryder, I want to be clear that the bank's preference is always to work with property holders toward resolution. Foreclosure is expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved." He'd paused. "I can offer you a 45-day review period. During that time, foreclosure proceedings will be paused. At the end of 45 days, if you can demonstrate verifiable revenue and a credible operational structure, we can discuss restructuring options."
Bom, pessoas,
Bien. 45 days instead of 90. Mason had taken it. He'd driven back to the yard afterward and told Ethan, and Ethan had said, 45 days, okay? And gone back to what he was doing, which was pulling a transmission out of a dead truck with a salvageable drivetrain. He'd said it the same way he said most things, not resigned, not panicked, just acknowledging the new parameter and adjusting. Mason had stood there watching his son work and thought, 45 days. Then he'd picked up his tools and gotten back to it. The fuel system on the flatbed came together by the end of that same week. The truck started on the third attempt, coughed badly, ran rough for about 2 minutes, and then steadied into a sound that was not beautiful but was functional. Ethan had stood next to Mason with his arms crossed and his head tilted, listening to the idle the way you listen to something that might be lying to you, and then he'd nodded once. "That'll run," he said. "It'll run," Mason agreed. They'd stood there listening to it together for another 30 seconds, neither of them saying anything, the exhaust curling up into the cold air. The recovery pickup had followed 9 days after that. The hydraulic line replacement had taken 2 days by itself. The routing was tighter than it looked from the outside, and one of the fittings had been cross-threaded at some point in the truck's previous life and needed to be drilled out and retapped before the new line would seat properly. Ethan had spent the better part of an afternoon on that fitting alone, working in a space so tight he had to do it mostly by feel, his face turned away and one arm reaching in at an angle that made Mason's shoulder ache just watching it.
You need me to... I've got it, Ethan had said, from somewhere inside the engine compartment. Your angle is wrong. If you come at it from, Dad, I've got it. Mason had stepped back. 5 minutes later, the fitting had come out. Ethan had emerged from the compartment with grease up to his elbow and a look of grim satisfaction. You could have asked, Mason said. I knew I had it, Ethan said. And he had. So that was that. The recovery truck's first real test came on a Tuesday morning, the 28th day of operation. A box truck had thrown a rear axle seal on the state road about 3 miles east of the property, and the driver, a freight hauler named Terry, who ran a small regional route, had pulled onto the shoulder and called around until someone at a truck stop near the interchange mentioned that there was a new service place a few miles back. Mason took the call on a prepaid phone he'd bought specifically for the business line. He was in the middle of patching the equipment shed roof at the time, which meant the call happened with him standing on a ladder with a sheet of metal roofing under one arm and the phone wedged between his shoulder and his ear. I can be there in 20 minutes, he said. It's an axle seal, Terry said, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been on the side of the road for 2 hours already. You actually do axle work, or is this just towing? I do the work, Mason said. What's your freight situation? Temperature sensitive. I've got a 4-hour window before I have to report a delay. I'll see what I can do. He'd come down the ladder, handed Ethan the roofing panel, and taken the recovery truck out. He'd gotten to Terry in 17 minutes. The axle seal was bad, but not catastrophic. The axle itself was fine, the housing was clean. It was a seal failure, pure and simple. Mason carried common seal sizes in the truck, had since the second week when he'd spent $40 on an assortment at the parts house in Gallup and put them in a labeled tray in the service drawer. He had the right size. He had the truck back on the road in an hour and 40 minutes. Terry had looked at the final time with an expression that was somewhere between relieved and disbelieving. Hour 40. Seal size was common, Mason said. Helped. Last time I blew a seal out here, the tow truck took 3 hours just to show up, and then I had to go to a shop in town. I know, Mason said. He wrote up the service ticket, labor plus the seal, $140. Terry paid it, then stood there for a moment like he was considering something. You got a card? Mason handed him one. Simple, printed at an office supply place in town, nothing fancy. Riders road service and yard, emergency, storage, repair. Terry looked at it, put it in his shirt pocket. I'm on this route twice a week, he said. I'll be here, Mason said. Terry drove off. Mason stood by the recovery truck on the shoulder of the state road and added $140 to the running total in his head. They were at just over $400 in 8 days of actual revenue-generating operation. $400 against $218,000. He drove back to the yard. Ethan was on the roof, finishing the patch. How'd it go? Ethan called down. Axle seal, hour 40. Nice. Ethan hammered something. Roof's almost done. Good, Mason said, and went inside to update the ledger. The word started to spread the way it spreads in tight communities. Not through advertising, not through any system, but through drivers talking to drivers. At fuel stops, at way stations, at the informal networks of people who spend their lives on long stretches of highway and develop, out of pure necessity, a sophisticated knowledge of what resources exist and which ones are actually reliable. A driver named Pete mentioned it to 2 other drivers at a Flying J near Amarillo. One of those drivers mentioned it to a dispatcher in Albuquerque, who noted it in the company's informal log of useful service points along the I-40 corridor. A woman named Diane, who ran a refrigerated freight route through the region, started stopping every Tuesday to use the parking,
and then started stopping other days too when the schedule allowed, and eventually asked Mason if he had somewhere she could offload a partial pallet that needed short-term climate-controlled storage while she repositioned her route. He didn't. Not then. But he thought about it, and 2 weeks later he'd cleaned out the interior of a 40-foot trailer he'd identified in the back of the yard, structurally sound, the refrigeration unit non-functional, but the box itself sealed and intact, and rigged a temporary heating system from a commercial propane unit he'd found in the shed. It wasn't certified climate-controlled storage. It wasn't anything official. But it was dry, it was consistent in temperature, and it was available. Diane moved a pallet of freight through it, then another. Then she told her dispatcher about it, and the dispatcher mentioned it to 2 other drivers. The property started to acquire a function. Not all at once and not cleanly. There was nothing clean about it. The yard was still a yard, still full of rusted metal and difficult ground, and a shed that was only partially repaired, and an office trailer with a folding chair, and a secondhand space heater that smelled faintly of burning dust when it first kicked on each morning. But function was accumulating, day by day, in the way that things accumulate when you keep showing up and keep solving the problem directly in front of you. Mason was at the property every day by 5:30. He slept there some nights on a cot he'd set up in the back of the trailer. When a job had run late, or when he'd calculated that driving back to the apartment and then back out again wasn't worth the time or the gas. Ethan kept similar hours most days, though he had a tendency to stay even later than Mason, working by work lamp on whatever mechanical problem had captured his attention, refusing to leave a thing unfinished if he could possibly help it. They ate lunch together most days, usually in the trailer, usually sandwiches from a cooler they'd replenished at the gas station in the morning. They didn't talk a lot during those lunches, not because there was tension between them, but because they were both tired and both thinking and both had already been talking all morning, talking through problems and decisions and the endless logistics of operating something that was always just barely ahead of the next crisis. Sometimes Ethan would say something about a driver he'd talked to that morning, or a mechanical issue he'd been working through, or something he'd looked up on his phone the night before about freight storage regulations, or commercial vehicle inspection requirements, or the state's rules around operating a salvage yard versus an operational vehicle business. He was reading. Mason hadn't told him to. Ethan had simply identified the gaps in their collective knowledge and started working on them the same way he worked on everything else. Did you know there's a specific registration process for operating as a third-party freight intermediary? Ethan said one afternoon, looking at his phone over the remains of his sandwich. I did not know that. We might be doing something adjacent to that already, with Diane's pallet situation. Probably better to know for sure. Yeah. Ethan kept reading. I'll figure out what category we actually fall into. He did. A week later, he'd laid out a single page of notes on the counter, what they were legally, what registrations they needed, what they didn't need yet, and would need eventually if certain things grew. Mason had read it twice and then said, "When did you get good at this?" Ethan had looked genuinely uncertain how to answer that. "I don't know," he said. "I just kept reading until it made sense." They filed 2 registrations and a business license amendment that cost them $160 in fees and about half a day of navigating state paperwork websites. By the end of the 6th week, the daily count of trucks using the parking lot had grown from single digits to an average of 11. Some were just parking, paying the daily fee, sleeping their hours, leaving without needing anything else. Some were coming for service calls. 2 freight companies had started using the storage trailer on a semi-regular basis. The recovered flatbed had made 4 runs for a regional parts hauler who needed short-hop freight moved when his regular carrier had availability gaps. The money was not good. Not yet. But it was becoming consistent, and consistency was what Mason had understood from the beginning was the actual product. Not any single service, but the reliability of the place. The fact that when a driver came off I-40 at that interchange at 2 in the morning with a mechanical problem or a desperate need for somewhere to sleep his legal rest hours, there was a light on and someone would answer the phone. That was worth something. He was starting to be able to quantify how much. There was a night in the 7th week when Mason was alone at the property. Ethan had driven into town for parts and hadn't come back yet, which wasn't unusual. When he sat in the folding chair in the trailer at 11 o'clock at night and opened the ledger and went through the numbers, The 45-day review had come and gone. Patterson at the bank had reviewed what Mason brought him, and with the careful, measured speech of a man who was moderately surprised by what he was seeing, agreed to a restructured repayment arrangement. Not forgiveness, not even particularly generous terms, but a structured plan that spread the debt repayment out over a longer period in exchange for demonstrated ongoing operation and monthly check-ins. Mason had signed the papers and driven back to the yard and told Ethan, and Ethan had said, "Good," and gone back to what he was doing. That had been a week ago. Now Mason sat with the ledger and ran the current numbers. Total revenue since day one, just over $9,000. Running costs, parts, fuel, supplies, the registration fees, a small amount for a prepaid cell plan for the business line, had consumed roughly $4,000 of that. The debt restructuring required a minimum monthly payment that would start at the beginning of the next month. He would make the first payment, not comfortably, but he would make it. He wrote that number down. $9,000 was not the same as $218,000. There was no version of the math where it was. But $9,000 was the difference between zero and something was the only raw material he actually had to work with. He turned the page in the ledger and started the next column. The property was changing in small ways that accumulated. The gravel apron near the front was finished and had been expanded twice already as the parking demand grew past the original area. The equipment shed had a functioning roof, both ends now, after a second repair session that had taken 3 days and left both Mason and Ethan with more metal cuts on their forearms than was probably advisable. The storage trailer had been cleaned out properly and organized, with wooden pallet racking that Ethan had built from salvaged lumber, and it was maintaining a consistent temperature that 2 freight companies had now certified as suitable for their purposes in writing. The school bus in the back corner, which Mason had looked at on that first rainy afternoon and written off as purely symbolic, had turned out to contain something useful. The previous owner, his father, had been using it as a parts storage room, organized, labeled, boxed. Hundreds of parts, mostly for heavy-duty vehicles, some common and some surprisingly specific. A portion of what Mason had spent in the first weeks buying parts he'd already had, sitting in boxes on the shelves of a school bus. Ethan had discovered this on a Thursday morning when he'd gone to check whether the bus would be worth stripping for scrap value. He'd opened the door and stood there for a moment and then come to get Mason. "Come look at this," was all he'd said. Mason had looked. He'd stood in the aisle of the old school bus looking at his father's organized part shelves and felt something move in his chest that he did not try to name. "He knew what he was doing," Ethan said quietly from behind him. "He always knew what he was doing," Mason said. "He just ran out of time." They'd cataloged the parts over 2 evenings. Some were obsolete, some were duplicates, some were exactly what they needed and had been needed for weeks. The catalog had taken the form of a spreadsheet on Ethan's laptop, which he'd organized by vehicle system, part type, and rough condition rating. He'd cross-referenced it against their most common service needs and identified the gaps, what they still needed to source, what they now had in surplus that could be used or sold. It was the kind of careful, unglamorous work that nobody looking at the junkyard from the outside would have imagined was happening inside it. Carlos came by one morning in the 9th week and walked the property with Mason and did not say anything for a long time. "This isn't what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" Carlos looked at the parking lot, the organized yard, the storage trailer with its new wooden racking visible through the open door. "I don't know. Less." He paused. "You look terrible, though." "Thanks. I mean it. Are you sleeping?" "Some." "Mason." "I'm sleeping enough," Mason said, which was not entirely accurate, but was not entirely a lie either. He was sleeping the minimum amount that kept his hands steady and his judgment functional. Whether that qualified as enough depended on who was asking. Carlos didn't push it. He walked to the recovered flatbed, ran his hand along the frame, looked at the tires. "This is the truck I told you needed 3,000 in parts. About 2,800 ended up." "What's it generating?" "About 600 a week right now on freight runs, plus whatever comes from service calls when I've got it staged at the yard." Carlos did the mental math, made a face that was not quite impressed but was close to it. "And Ethan's handling the yard when you're out on runs?" He handles the yard. I handle the runs and the bigger mechanical work. We swap when it makes sense. Mason looked across the property. He's better at the organizational stuff than I am. The paperwork, the cataloging. He's got the parts inventory on a spreadsheet now. How old is that kid? 20. Carlos shook his head slowly. Your dad would have liked seeing this, he said. Mason didn't answer that. After a moment, he said, You want coffee? It's not good, but it's hot. Yeah, Carlos said. Sure. The 10th week brought a problem with one of the drivers, a man named Roger, who'd been using the lot twice weekly and had started expecting what he called professional courtesy, which in practice meant he wanted his parking fee waived in exchange for what he characterized as the volume of business he brought. The volume was 2 truck visits per week. The parking fee was $18 per visit. Mason had the conversation with him on a Tuesday morning, standing in the lot with the cold coming off the ground and 2 other drivers coming and going around them. Roger, I appreciate the regular business, he said, but $36 a week is $36 a week. I can't operate this place on courtesy. I've been telling guys about this place, Roger said. He was a big man, not unfriendly exactly, but with the particular entitlement of someone who had spent years being accommodated. I've sent you business. I appreciate that. And those drivers pay their fees too. Roger's expression tightened slightly. You're going to lose customers treating people this way. Maybe, Mason said, but I'll still be here, and I'll still have drivers who want a reliable lot. You're welcome to keep using it at the standard rate. Roger paid. He didn't like it, and he made a show of not liking it, but he paid. He came back the following Tuesday too. Ethan had watched the conversation from near the trailer door and didn't say anything until Roger's truck had pulled out. You handled that well, he said. I've had that conversation before, Mason said, just in different settings. The job? The job. Other places. He picked up the coffee he'd set down on the nearest post. Nobody respects a rate they didn't have to pay. Ethan considered that. That's going in my mental file, he said, and went back inside. There was a quality to those weeks that Mason would have had difficulty explaining to anyone who asked, a kind of compressed, relentless, unglamorous momentum. Nothing happened the way it did in the version of events you imagined in advance. The parts that were supposed to be easy were complicated, and the parts that looked complicated occasionally turned out to be straightforward, and almost everything took longer than he'd projected and cost slightly more than he'd budgeted and required some adaptation that he couldn't have anticipated. But they kept moving. That was the operative fact. They kept moving, and the operation kept accumulating function, and the ledger kept showing numbers that were small but real. One evening, late in the 11th week, Ethan came out of the storage trailer where he'd been reorganizing the pallet, racking with an idea he'd apparently been sitting on for a while. I've been thinking about the repair center, he said. Mason was sitting on the bumper of the recovery truck, cleaning a fuel injector. What about it? We've been doing roadside repair and recovery, and we're doing parking and storage. But drivers who come in here for service, sometimes they've got a problem that's bigger than a roadside fix, something that needs a few hours and a proper lift. We don't have a lift. No, but the equipment shed is big enough, and there's a 2-post lift in the back row under a tarp next to the school bus. I checked it last week. The hydraulics are gone, but the structure's sound. The pump could be rebuilt. Mason looked up from the injector. How long have you known about that lift? 3 weeks, Ethan said. I wanted to make sure the storage side was sorted before I brought it up. One thing at a time. Mason looked at his son. He was standing with his hands in his work jacket pockets, his hair pushed back, grease on his jaw from something earlier in the day, looking approximately twice as certain as he had any right to be for someone who'd started this not knowing whether any of it would work. How much to rebuild the pump? Mason asked. I priced it out. Around $400 if we do the rebuild ourselves. Maybe $6 if we need to farm out the machining on the cylinder. Parts we have? Some. I made a list. Of course he'd made a list. Mason set down the injector. He looked at the equipment shed across the yard, the one they'd repaired the roof on, the one that was now organized and functional, the one that had gone from leaning and half collapsed to something that a driver could pull into without worrying it would fall on him. Show me the lift, he said. They went to the back row with a flashlight, pulled the tarp back. The lift was old, a heavy commercial two-post from a manufacturer that had gone out of business 15 years ago. But the uprights were solid steel and the crossbar was intact. And when Mason checked the anchor bolts in the concrete pad it had been mounted on, they were tight. "The concrete pad is already here," Ethan said. "I see that." Dad had probably planned this too. Mason ran his hand along the upright. The paint was flaking and there was surface rust, but underneath it the metal was sound. He knocked on it once, listening to the tone. "Get your list," Mason said. Ethan produced it from his jacket pocket. Actually, literally, had it there. Mason took the list and read it in the flashlight beam, and when he finished, he folded it and put it in his own pocket and looked at the lift, and then at the shed, and then at the back of the property where the rows of old trucks sat in the dark. His father had planned this. Not just the parking area near the front, all of it. The shed, the lift, the layout of the property. The pieces were all here, in the places where they were supposed to be, waiting for someone to come back and finish what had been started. "Okay," Mason said. "We'll do it right. Lift first, then we see about getting a second service truck running by the end of next month." Ethan nodded. "I was also thinking, one thing at a time," Mason said. "Like you said." His son almost smiled at that. Almost. They walked back through the dark yard toward the light of the trailer, the gravel crunching under their boots, and somewhere on the state road a truck went by, its running lights amber in the dark, headed west toward the interchange, toward the long stretch of I-40 that ran through the high desert and connected everything to everything else. The yard was quiet. The ledger was on the counter inside, and the numbers in it were still small, and the debt was still large, and the winter was coming. Mason could feel it in the air already, the particular dry cold of the high desert in October, the kind that settled in early and stayed. He didn't know yet what the winter would bring. He only knew what the work in front of him was, and that was enough to start with. Derek Ryder showed up on a Wednesday morning in early November, which was notable because Derek almost never showed up anywhere without calling first, and he hadn't called. Mason was under the recovered flatbed doing a brake inspection when he heard the car pull in. Not a truck. The sound was wrong for a truck. Too light, too quiet. And he slid out from underneath and saw his brother standing at the edge of the gravel apron in a jacket that cost more than Mason's monthly fuel budget, looking around the property with an expression that Mason had seen on exactly two other people, Gerald Holt, the estate attorney, and Ava Kensington. It was the expression of someone doing math. "You didn't call," Mason said. He was still on the ground, on the creeper board, looking up at his brother from a bad angle. "I was in Albuquerque for work," Derek said. "Figured I'd come see what you've built." He said built the way you'd say it about a child's craft project, with the particular warmth of someone who does not actually think much of the thing, but is trying to be supportive about it. Mason got up. He wiped his hands on a rag that wasn't clean enough to make any difference and looked at his brother. They were similar in the face, same jaw, same eyes, though Derek kept his hair shorter and had added about 15 pounds in the 4 years since Phoenix, the comfortable kind of weight that came from good restaurants and sedentary prosperity. "It's coming along," Mason said. "I can see that." Derek walked a few steps toward the lot, looked at the parked trucks. There were 4 of them, a decent Wednesday morning count. "This is actually more than I thought." "Thanks. I mean that as a compliment." "I know you do." Mason folded the rag and set it on the bumper. "Come inside. I'll get you coffee." They sat in the trailer, Mason in the folding chair and Derek on the plastic crate that served as the second seat when there was a second person, which wasn't often. Derek held the coffee mug Mason gave him and looked around the trailer interior. The ledger on the counter, the filing system Ethan had built from a second-hand metal cabinet, the whiteboard on the wall where Mason tracked outstanding service calls and scheduled maintenance. "You've been at this, 3 months?" Derek said. 11 weeks. And it's generating enough to make the bank payment," Mason said, "every month." Derek nodded slowly. "That's good. That's genuinely good, Mason." He paused. "But you're still a long way from servicing the underlying debt in any meaningful way." "I know where I am. I'm just saying that the structure as it exists, parking, storage, roadside service, it's got a ceiling. You'd need to scale significantly to generate the kind of revenue that actually moves the needle on 200 grand. I know that too. Derek turned his mug in his hands. I've been thinking, he said. I could come on as a partner. Not operationally. I'm not moving to New Mexico, that's not. But as a financial partner. Capital injection, plus some business development work I could do remotely. Contacts in commercial real estate, some freight industry relationships from clients I've worked with. Mason looked at him. You want to be a partner? I want to help my brother not drown in debt, Derek said. And yes, a formal partnership would make sense given the level of involvement. You weren't involved 11 weeks ago, or 7 weeks ago, or last month when the hydraulic pump rebuild cost us more than we budgeted, and I was doing shift math at midnight trying to figure out if we could cover it. Something shifted in Derek's expression. Not quite hurt, but close. I would have helped if you'd asked. I didn't ask because it's my property and my operation, Mason said. And he said it without anger, just flat and clear. Dad left it to me. Not to us. To me. I understand that. I don't think you do, actually. I think you see something that's starting to work and you want a position in it, which I get. That's a reasonable thing to want, but the answer is no. Derek was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck's air brakes released. One of the parked rigs getting ready to pull out. The sound familiar enough now that Mason tracked it without consciously registering it. I could be useful to you, Derek said. I know you could, Mason said. And if there's a day when I need something specific that you can help with, I'll ask. But I'm not giving up ownership in this property. Not to the bank, not to a billionaire who showed up in the second week with a checkbook, and not to you. The mention of the billionaire made Derek pause. Someone offered to buy it? Early on, I said no. Derek looked at him with an expression that was harder to read. Not the performing patience expression from before, something more genuinely uncertain. You turned down a buyout, and now you're turning down a partner. Correct. Why? Mason thought about how to answer that and decided the simplest version was the true one. Because it's ours, mine and Ethan's. And I'm not diluting that for money I don't currently need badly enough. Derek set down his coffee mug. He looked at the whiteboard, the ledger, the filing cabinet, the window where you could see the lot and the trucks, and the equipment shed with its repaired roof. Okay, he said. His voice was level. Maybe too level. You're welcome out here any time, Mason said. As my brother. I know, Derek said. He left an hour later. He shook Mason's hand at the gate. Not Ethan's. Ethan had been in the shed when Derek arrived and had stayed there, and drove back toward the highway in his quiet, expensive car. Mason watched him go and then stood there for a moment before going back to the brake inspection. He didn't know it yet, but that conversation was the thing that would almost cost him everything. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment, a question, something sideways and hard to source. The first indication was Terry, the box truck driver who'd been one of their early regulars, the axle seal repair back in the first month, the man who'd put their card in his shirt pocket and come back twice a week ever since. Terry showed up one morning looking at Mason differently than usual. Not unfriendly, just watchful. Had a guy ask me about this place, Terry said while Mason was writing up his parking receipt. At the way station on Tuesday. What kind of question? He said he'd heard some things about parts going missing from loads that got stored here. Terry watched Mason's face when he said it. I told him that wasn't my experience, but figured you should know it's out there. Mason stopped writing. Parts going missing. That's what he said. Who was the guy? Don't know him. Runs a dry van route out of Flagstaff, I think. Said he'd heard it secondhand. Mason finished the receipt. He handed it to Terry. The storage trailer gets logged in and logged out. Everything that goes in is documented with weight and count. Ethan does it for every pallet, every time. I believe you, Terry said. I'm just telling you what's out there. Mason nodded. I appreciate it. After Terry pulled out, he went and found Ethan in the shed, who was in the middle of reinstalling the rebuilt lift pump. We have a problem, Mason said, and told him what Terry had said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He had a wrench in his hand and he turned it slowly. Missing parts from stored freight. That's the rumor. That's not... We've never had a discrepancy. Not once. Every log matches. I know. Then where's it coming from? Mason didn't answer that immediately. He looked at the floor of the shed, at the grease-stained concrete, at the outline where the lift had been repositioned. He thought about Derek's car pulling out of the property and the way Derek's voice had gone level at the end of the conversation. Too level. He didn't say that out loud. Not then. It was still a hypothesis, and he'd learned the hard way in other contexts that acting on a hypothesis before you had enough evidence was how you created problems where there hadn't been any before. I don't know where it's coming from, he said, but we need to tighten the documentation, timestamp everything, camera. We don't have a camera. Get one, Mason said. Whatever's cheapest that actually works. Ethan nodded. Okay. He paused. Dad, if this is what I think it might be, don't say it yet, Mason said. Let's see what else comes. What came next arrived in the form of a phone call, 2 days later, from a dispatcher at a regional freight company called Mesa Run Logistics. Her name was Sandra, and she'd been routing 2 of her drivers through riders on a semi-regular basis for the last month. She was professional and not unkind, but what she said was direct. I've had a driver report that he's uncomfortable with the storage situation there, something about inventory control. What specifically? Mason kept his voice even. He's heard that there have been issues with freight going through your facility. I want to be clear. This is second or third hand, and I'm calling you directly because that's the fair thing to do before I make any routing decisions. Sandra, I want you to know that we log every load in and out. Every pallet is counted, documented, and signed. We haven't had a single discrepancy since we opened. I believe that may be the case, she said carefully, but perception matters in this industry. If drivers don't feel confident in a facility, that affects whether they'll use it. I understand. I'd like to invite you to come see the operation in person, or send someone. A pause. I may do that. In the meantime, I'm going to have to reroute my drivers to Albuquerque for storage needs. I understand, Mason said again. He hung up the phone and sat there for a moment. Then he picked it up again and called Linda. I've got a reputation problem, he said, and explained it. Linda listened. When he finished, she said, Is it competitors? Someone with a stake in you not succeeding? Could be, he said. He looked out the trailer window at the lot. Could be more personal than that. Mason, if you know who it is... I don't know. I suspect. Then be careful, she said. Don't accuse, document, and call me if it escalates. It escalated. By the 3rd week of November, 4 regulars had reduced their usage. Not stopped, reduced. Coming once where they'd been coming twice, or using only parking where they'd been using storage and service. None of them said directly why, but the numbers showed it in the ledger clear as anything, a 17% drop in weekly revenue in the span of 10 days. Mason found the camera, a weatherproof security unit, $90 at a hardware store, and Ethan mounted it above the storage trailer door. They printed fresh intake logs and started requiring a driver's signature at both drop-off and pickup. Mason began making calls himself, personally, to every regular who'd reduced their visits, not to push them, but just to check in, to ask if there was anything he could do better, to make himself available. Some of them were vague. 2 of them told him the same thing Terry had. There was talk. They didn't know where it started. They were being cautious. On a Tuesday evening, about 10 days after the rumors had begun, Ethan came out of the trailer with his phone in his hand and the look on his face that meant he'd found something. There's a post, he said, on a private Facebook group for drivers on the I-40 corridor. Someone posted asking if anyone had had problems with a freight yard near the Gallup interchange. No name, but the description is us. What does it say? Mostly vague, and heard there were issues, or she'll be careful with your cargo, and that kind of thing. Ethan's jaw was tight. The account that posted it was created a month ago. No photo, no identifying information. 47 friends. Mason held out his hand. Ethan gave him the phone. He read the post. It was careful. Careful enough to not be actionable. Careful enough to create doubt without stating anything specific. The kind of damage that was hardest to fight because there was nothing solid to grab onto. He scrolled through the responses. Most were skeptical or asked for specifics that the original poster didn't provide. A few were the kind of amplifying agreement that didn't require evidence, enough to spread. He handed the phone back. He went inside. He sat in the folding chair. He looked at the ledger. 11 weeks of work. The lift now operational in the shed. The storage trailer documented and functioning. The recovery truck running. The flatbed running. A second service vehicle halfway through its rebuild. The bank payment made on time 2 months running. 12 drivers who used the lot regularly enough to know Mason and Ethan by name. 17% down. And dropping. He thought about Derek and the level voice and the car pulling out of the property. He still didn't say it out loud, but he stopped not knowing. He called Carlos. "You hear anything in town about us?" he asked. Carlos was quiet for a moment. "I heard something. Didn't know if it was worth bringing up." "Tell me." Guy at the parts house mentioned that he'd heard there was a yard near the interchange having trouble with freight going missing. I told him that was nonsense. I'd been out there. Did he say where he heard it? He said someone told someone who runs a storage facility in town. One of the places that competes with what you're doing. Mason sat with that. The storage facility in town had been losing business to Ryder's Yard. He knew that from 2 drivers who'd told him directly that they'd switched because of price and availability. Someone at that facility, or connected to it, had a reason to want the rumors to exist. But that didn't mean they'd started them. It meant they might have helped spread them. "Carlos," Mason said, "did Derek call you? In the last few weeks?" A pause, longer than necessary for a simple no. "He called me," Carlos said. "Asked some questions about the yard, how it was operating, what the volume looked like. I didn't tell him anything he couldn't see from a visit." "Did he mention the storage situation? The freight storage specifically?" Another pause. "He asked if you had proper insurance for stored freight." Mason closed his eyes for a second. "Okay," he said. "Thanks, Carlos." "Mason, it's okay. I'm not mad at you." "I didn't know what he was doing." "I know," Mason said. "I know you didn't." He sat in the trailer after he hung up and looked at the wall for a while. Not the whiteboard, not the ledger. Just the wall. Derek hadn't spread the rumors directly. That wasn't his style. It had never been his style. His style was the question planted in the right place, the doubt raised in the right conversation, the inquiry that created an impression without stating a fact. He'd asked Carlos about insurance, knowing that Carlos would mention it to someone, knowing that a question about insurance in context of freight storage implied a concern about liability, implying a concern about what happened to things stored there. It was clean, and it was deniable, and it was working. Mason thought about calling him. He decided not to. Not yet. Because what he was about to do required every hour he had, and spending hours on his brother was a cost he couldn't afford right now. The temperature had been dropping for a week. The weather services were tracking a system moving out of the Colorado Rockies, a large one. The forecasters were using language that was slightly more emphatic than usual, words like significant and multi-day event, and from one National Weather Service bulletin Ethan showed him on his phone, potentially historic accumulation along the I-40 corridor. Mason read the bulletin. He looked at the date. They had 4 days. He spent those 4 days doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was working the phone, calling every regular driver and dispatcher he had a relationship with, not to beg for business back, but to tell them, plainly and without drama, that the storage documentation was airtight, that he was happy to provide full logs to anyone who wanted them, that there had not been a single instance of missing or damaged freight in Ryder's Yard in 3 months of operation. He said it once to each person, without pressing. He let it sit. The second thing was preparing. He and Ethan spent those 4 days building capacity for a storm. They pulled every fuel container on the property and filled them. They inventoried the emergency supplies, tow chains, straps, sand spreaders, 2 old snowplows that had been in the back row and which Ethan had identified 2 weeks earlier as candidates for the service trucks. They pulled the better of the 2 plows and spent a day mounting it on the flatbed. "Plow blade mounts aren't designed for this truck," Ethan said, examining the connection points. "Can you make it work?" Ethan looked at it for a long time. "I can make it work." He made it work. It took longer than a day and required fabricating 2 custom bracket plates in the shed, which Ethan did on the salvaged welder they'd restored in the 8th week, running bead after bead on the steel until the brackets were solid enough that Mason tried to move them by hand and couldn't. They stocked the trailer with food, propane, blankets. Mason called the bank of drivers they knew and told them that the yard would be open through the storm, that if they got caught on I-40, Riders was a viable emergency option, that there was parking, shelter in the form of the storage trailer reconfigured with some basic amenities and service capability for vehicles that needed it. He also hung up a hand-lettered sign at the gate. Open during storm. Emergency shelter available. Call the number. Ethan looked at the sign. That could mean a lot of people showing up here. Yes, Mason said. We're 2 people. I know. Ethan looked at the sign for another moment. Okay, he said. The storm hit I-40 on a Thursday night. It came faster and harder than the updated forecasts had suggested, which the later reports would attribute to a pressure system that had accelerated unexpectedly over the Colorado border. By 10 p.m., the interstate was reporting multiple accidents and chain restrictions were going into effect. By midnight, sections of I-40 were being closed in both directions, westbound first and then eastbound, as the snow came down at a rate that overwhelmed the plowing capacity of the highway department. The calls started at 9:30. The first was a driver named Greg, who Mason knew from the parking lot, a dry van operator who ran produce freight through the region. He was 17 miles west of the interchange, moving slow, wanted to know if the yard was accessible. Come in, Mason said. Gates open. Greg arrived at 10:45, his rig caked with snow. 2 other drivers had apparently followed him off the interstate without knowing where they were going. They came in behind him, strangers, their faces tight with the particular exhaustion of men who had been managing dangerous conditions for hours. Is there room? One of them asked. There's room, Mason said. By midnight, there were 9 trucks in the lot. By 2 in the morning, there were 16. The lot was full, beyond full. Mason was directing drivers to positions he hadn't planned as parking, the gravel apron extended by the work lights they'd set up. Him and Ethan in the cold with their breath-fogging, waving trucks into slots with flashlights, the snow coming sideways and the wind making it hard to hear anything clearly. A woman showed up in a pickup truck at 2:30, not a driver. She'd been traveling on the state road and had slid into a ditch a mile down. Ethan had taken the recovery pickup out, while Mason stayed at the lot and pulled her out in 40 minutes and brought her back to the yard. My car is okay? She kept saying from the passenger seat of the recovery truck on the way back. Your car is fine, Ethan said. Front fender's got a scratch from the ditch wall. Everything else is good. I didn't know where else to go. You saw the sign, Ethan said. I saw the sign, she said. Mason reconfigured the storage trailer at 3 a.m. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, actually, not for storm scenarios specifically, but as a general possibility. The wooden pallet racking Ethan had built was modular, could be disassembled. They pulled the racking out and stacked it, and the storage trailer became a shelter, 8 by 40 feet of dry, heated space. Mason ran the propane heater at full and put the blankets they'd stocked on the floor along the walls. He opened the trailer to whoever needed it. By 4 in the morning, 11 people were in the storage trailer. Drivers who'd been in their cabs for hours. The woman from the pickup truck, a family of 4 who'd been driving a minivan when the state road became impassable. Father and mother and 2 kids. The older one maybe 8, the younger one asleep against her mother's shoulder before they'd been inside 5 minutes. Someone had a camp stove. Mason didn't remember who'd produced it or when. Somewhere in the logistics of that night, things had started just happening, people helping, drivers who'd been here before knowing where things were kept and getting them without being asked. Coffee was made. Someone found the box of granola bars Mason kept in the trailer cabinet and passed them around. Mason stood in the doorway of the storage trailer for a moment, looking at the people inside. The light was warm from the propane heater. The noise outside, the wind, the creak of metal, the distant sound of trucks idling, was reduced to a background pressure against the walls. He went back out. The flatbed with the plow went out 4 times between 2 and 6 a.m. Mason drove it the first time. Ethan drove it twice more. Mason took the last run. They weren't plowing the highway. They didn't have the authority or the capacity for that. They were clearing the access road, keeping the lot surface manageable, and twice going out on the state road to move vehicles that had stopped moving and were blocking the passage of anything else. The second of those runs, at around 4:30 in the morning, involved a truck that had slid sideways across both lanes of the state road about 2 miles from the yard. The driver was fine, shaken, standing beside his cab in the snow with his hazards going. Mason got the flatbed positioned upwind and used the tow rig on the rear to drag the trailer section back into alignment enough to clear the road. It took 45 minutes, and both of them working in the dark and the wind, and when it was done, the driver stood there looking at Mason with an expression that was hard to read in the dark. "How much?" the driver said. It was the practical question. Mason understood it, respected it actually. The man trying to establish the transaction even in the middle of all this. "We'll sort it out in the morning," Mason said. "Come back to the yard, there's coffee." The driver came back. By dawn, the snow had slowed to a manageable level, and the sky had gone from black to the particular flat gray that follows a heavy storm. Mason stood at the gate and looked at the lot. 22 trucks, a minivan, 2 pickup trucks, people beginning to stir in the storage trailer, a few drivers already back at their cabs, the family with the kids. The father had come and shaken Mason's hand at some point in the night, hadn't said much, just shaken it hard. Ethan came and stood beside him. He had snow in his hair and there was a long grease mark on the side of his neck that was definitely from the truck work, and not from anything in the last several hours. He looked exactly as tired as a person who had been working for 17 straight hours in sub-zero wind looked. "How many service calls logged?" Mason asked. Ethan had the notebook. He'd been keeping track. Of course he had. 14, plus the road clearance runs, plus 11 people in the shelter, which I didn't log as service calls, but I've got their names. "Good. We're out of coffee." "I know. And we're low on propane." "I know that too." Ethan looked at the lot. At the 22 trucks, the people starting to move around in the early gray light, the sign at the gate still visible under its coating of snow. He looked tired in the way that was past the point where tiredness matters, where the body has made a kind of truce with the situation and just keeps going. "We didn't lose anybody," Ethan said. "No," Mason said. "We didn't." He meant it as the operational fact it was. What? Nobody had gotten hurt. Nobody had gone missing. The freight in the lot was intact. The shelter had held. But Ethan had said it with a weight that went past the operational. They stood there together while the sun came up behind the clouds and the light got a little brighter, and around them the yard that had started as a rusted problem and a ledger showing $12 moved and breathed with the weight of 22 trucks and people who were alive and warm because there had been a light on and a gate open. Mason was aware, in a way he hadn't quite been before, of how close it had all come to not being there. How close he had come 3 months ago to making the rational decision. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. A number he didn't recognize, a 602 area code. "Phoenix." He stared at it for a second and then declined the call and put the phone back in his pocket. Whatever Derek had to say could wait. The lot had 22 trucks and a family with 2 kids, and they were out of coffee and low on propane, and Mason had a ledger to update and calls to return and a yard to run. He went back to work. The morning after the storm, the interstate reopened in stages. Westbound first, around 7 a.m., with a convoy of plows running ahead of traffic. Eastbound followed 2 hours later. The state road cleared enough for movement by mid-morning, and through the yard's gate, Mason could watch the slow procession of trucks beginning to pull out. Engines warming up, air brakes cycling, the particular choreography of a lot full of heavy vehicles getting themselves organized to move again. He'd been awake for 22 hours. He knew this not because he'd been counting, but because he'd started counting at some point around 4 in the morning when the counting had become something to do besides register the cold. The family with the 2 kids left first. The father, his name was Paul, Mason had learned, a man in his mid-30s who'd been driving his family back from a Thanksgiving visit in Flagstaff when the storm had closed the road, came and found Mason at the gate while his wife got the children into the minivan. "I want to pay you," Paul said. He had his wallet out. "You don't have to," Mason said. "I want to." He was firm about it, not aggressive, just clear. "You open that trailer for my kids. Name a number." Mason looked at him. $40. That's the standard shelter rate. Paul looked at the wallet, took out 60 and held it out. Keep the change. Keep it, Paul said, and shook Mason's hand, and went and got in his minivan and drove his family out through the gate. Mason stood there with $60 in his hand for a moment. Then he put it in his shirt pocket and went back to the lot. The truck drivers settled their accounts through the morning as they prepared to leave. Mason had Ethan handle the paperwork, the service logs, the parking fees, the recovery charges for the tows and road clearance. Most of the drivers paid without question. A few negotiated reasonably, and Mason authorized the adjustments Ethan brought to him because reasonable negotiation was fine and storm conditions were not standard conditions, and charging standard rates for everything that had happened in the night would have been the wrong call. By noon, most of the trucks had pulled out. The lot was down to 7 vehicles, drivers who still had mandatory rest hours running or who were waiting on cargo instructions, or who were in no hurry and had decided that another few hours of sleep was worth more than being the first back on the road. One section of the lot still had 4 trucks in it that had been there since around midnight. Mason had noticed them when they came in. The branding on the trailers was consistent, a clean white with a stylized K and a fleet number, professional equipment, newer than most of what he was seeing. He'd helped direct them in like everything else and hadn't thought about it further. He was in the shed doing a review of the lift, checking that the night's temperature hadn't affected the hydraulics, when Ethan came in from outside. "There's a car at the gate," Ethan said. "Another driver?" "No, it's a Range Rover." Ethan paused. "Black, clean." Mason set down his tool. He looked at Ethan. "Okay," he said. He walked out into the cold morning light and across the lot, past the remaining trucks, to the gate. The Range Rover was there, idling, the same one he'd seen 2 months ago. Ava Kensington got out before he reached the gate, and she was dressed differently than she'd been the first time. The same practical quality, but there was something less composed about her this morning, or maybe composed was the wrong word. She looked like someone who had been working and was continuing to work, not like someone who had prepared to arrive. She looked at the lot, at the tracks in the snow, the cleared gravel, the hand-lettered sign still visible at the gate, at the storage trailer with its door standing open, the makeshift shelter configuration still partially visible inside. Then she looked at Mason. "4 of those trucks are mine," she said. It wasn't an accusation, and it wasn't gratitude yet. It was information, stated plainly, establishing a context. "I know," Mason said. He'd looked up the fleet number on the trailer branding around 2 a.m. while he was keeping track of everyone in the lot. Kensington Freight and Logistics. He'd logged the trucks like he'd logged everything else and kept moving. She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved across the property. The rebuilt lift visible through the shed's open door, the storage trailer, the flatbed with the plow still mounted on the front, the gravel lot that was now significantly larger than it had been the first time she'd stood here. "You kept them here through the night," she said. "I kept everyone here through the night." "My drivers told me—" She stopped, recalibrated slightly. "They called me this morning, 2 of them, said that you went out on the state road at 4 a.m. to clear a disabled vehicle. It was blocking both lanes. My drivers were in the shelter when you did it. There were kids in there." She said this not as a sentimental observation, but as a fact that was registering somewhere in her as significant. "The family was fine," Mason said. "They left about an hour ago." Ava looked at him. The morning light was flat and gray, the sky still carrying the remnants of the storm system. And in that light she looked less like the version of herself he'd seen in October, the precise, measured woman doing a property assessment, and more like what she actually was, which was someone very intelligent trying to reconcile something that wasn't adding up. "Can I walk the property again?" she asked. Mason stepped back from the gate and held it open. She walked the way she'd walked the first time, purposeful, taking in everything, her eyes doing the same quick assessing work he'd seen before. But she was stopping more this time. She stopped at the storage trailer, stepped inside, looked at the pallet racking stacked against one wall, and the blankets folded near the propane heater and the camp stove someone had left on the floor that Mason hadn't had a chance to return yet. She stopped at the lift in the shed. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and Mason could see her working through the fact that it was operational. The hydraulic lines, the rebuilt pump, the anchor bolts, the whole thing functioning where before it had been buried under a tarp. She stopped at the parts trailer, the school bus, which had been partially reorganized but was still visibly a parts catalog, labeled boxes on wooden shelves, Ethan's inventory system printed out and taped to the wall near the door. "This is the bus from the back corner," she said. "Yes." "You didn't scrap it." "There was a reason it was still here." She turned and looked at the school bus for another moment, and then at him. "Your father." "Yes." She walked to the back of the property and stood where Mason had stood on that first rainy afternoon, the spot where you could see the whole layout, the cleared parking area, the equipment shed, the storage trailer, the rebuilt vehicles in their positions, the rows of old trucks along the edges that were gradually being worked through for salvage and parts. The property was not beautiful. It was never going to be beautiful in any conventional sense. It was a working yard in the high desert in November, with snow still sitting in the shadows and mud where the traffic had churned the gravel edges, and the smell of diesel and metal that never fully left the air. But it was organized and it was functional. And if you looked at it the right way, which was the way Mason had been looking at it since the first afternoon, you could see the logic of it, the structure that had been there underneath the rust and the debt all along. Ava Kensington was looking at it that way now. Mason could tell by the way she'd gone still. "I made an assessment in October," she said without turning around. "I told you this property had no future." "You did." She turned. Her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it, not emotional in any theatrical sense, just open, in the way of someone who has decided to say the accurate thing rather than the defended thing. "I was wrong about the property," she said, "and I was wrong about you." Mason didn't say anything. He'd imagined this conversation, or versions of it, in the weeks since October. In those imagined versions, he had various responses, some of them gracious, some of them sharper. Now that it was actually happening, he didn't have any response. The simple fact of her saying it was enough. "The location is what I assessed correctly," she said. "The logistical value of the position relative to the interchange, that I had right." She paused. "What I didn't account for was what the location could become in the hands of someone who understood how to run it." "You didn't know who I was," Mason said. "No, I only saw the debt and the timeline and the assets, which is usually sufficient." Her voice was dry, but not unkind. It wasn't, in this case. They walked back toward the front of the property, toward the gate where her Range Rover was still idling. "My 4 trucks are undamaged," she said. "The freight is intact. My drivers got their mandatory rest in a warm shelter instead of in cabs on the side of a closed interstate." She looked at him. "What do you charge for last night?" "Standard rates plus the emergency surcharge I've got on the service list," Mason said. "Ethan's got the breakdown. Parking, shelter, the 2 road clearance assists on the state road that affected access for your vehicles." "Send me the invoice." "I will." She stopped at the gate. She turned and looked at the property one more time. The whole of it, the way you look at something when you're deciding how to think about it differently than you have been. "I want to make you another offer," she said. Mason looked at her. "Another buyout." "No." She said it without hesitation, which was interesting. "Not a buyout. A purchase price of $1.2 million, clear above and beyond the debt settlement. You'd walk away with 1.2 in your pocket, no obligations." He'd had time to think, in those imagined conversations, about what this number would feel like when someone said it out loud. What he felt was not what he expected. It wasn't the lure of it exactly, or the pull of easy resolution after 3 months of grinding work. It was something more like a clarifying quiet, a moment where the decision that had always been true became visible rather than theoretical. "No," he said. She looked at him carefully. "You understand what I'm offering." $1.2 million. Yes, I understand. "The property isn't worth that at current operational state," she said. "I'm pricing in the location value and the operational potential. It's a fair offer. Actually, it's a generous one." "I know it's generous." "Then, I don't want to sell it," Mason said. "Not at 1.2, not at 2, not at whatever number you're thinking of saying next." He said it without heat, the same way he'd said no to everything else that had been presented to him as the rational option. My father spent 30 years on this property. I've spent 3 months finishing what he started. Ethan has put in as many hours as I have. I'm not selling that. Ava was quiet. She looked at him with an expression that was harder to read than her previous ones. Not the assessment expression, not the open admission from 5 minutes ago. Something in between. So what do you want? She asked. And that was the question that mattered. That was the one Mason had actually been thinking about. Not in the abstract, but in the specific, in the ledger, and the operational reality, and the bank payment structure, and the numbers that still had a long way to go before the debt was resolved. I want a partner, he said, not an owner. A partner. She didn't react visibly, just kept looking at him with the same unreadable expression. I've got the location, the operational infrastructure, and the relationships with the driver community along this corridor, he said. What I don't have is capital for expansion or access to the kind of freight contracts that would turn this from a regional service hub into something that actually serves major carriers at scale. He paused. You've got those things. You also have a logistics network that could benefit from a dedicated service and recovery facility at this location, on I-40. You're proposing a joint venture, she said. I'm proposing that you bring capital and contracts and I bring the facility and the operation. Revenue share, structured properly, with ownership of the land staying with me. He watched her face. You don't get to buy it, but you get to benefit from what it becomes. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the gate, the sign, the lot beyond it. You've thought about this, she said. I've thought about it for a while. Since October. Since about the 3rd week of November, he said. Which was true. He'd spent the period when the rumors were hitting hardest, not just managing the crisis, but thinking about what came after it, because the only useful thing to do with a difficult period was to work through it toward whatever was on the other side. Ava Kensington looked at him for a moment that stretched out long enough to be noticeable. Then she said, I need to see your books. I figured you would. Current operational data, revenue, costs, service logs, the works. Ethan can pull it together by tomorrow morning. And I'll want a structural assessment of the property, independent. That's fair. And the partnership terms would need to be negotiated properly. Attorneys, a formal structure. Agreed. She nodded once, the way she'd done things throughout. Decisive, not drawn out. I'm not committing to anything today, she said, but I'm not declining. That's enough to start, Mason said. She reached out and shook his hand. It was the same handshake as October. Practiced, reflexive, firm, but something about the context of it was different, and they both seemed to know that without saying anything about it. She got in the Range Rover. Then the window came down. Mr. Ryder, she said. Mason. Mason. She looked through the window at the yard. Why didn't you just take the buyout, in October or today? She wasn't challenging it. She seemed genuinely curious, the way someone is curious about a decision they can't quite model. Mason looked at the property, at the sign at the gate, and the shed with its solid roof, and the storage trailer that had held 11 people through the night, and the flatbed with the snow still caked on the plow blade. Because selling it would have been giving up on something that wasn't finished, he said, and I don't do that. She looked at him for a moment. Then the window went up and the Range Rover pulled out through the gate and onto the access road. Mason stood at the gate and watched it go. He stayed there for maybe a minute. Then he turned and went back across the lot toward the shed, because the hydraulic check on the lift wasn't finished and there was still work to do. Ethan was coming out of the trailer as Mason crossed the lot. He had the ledger under his arm and a cup of coffee in his hand, and he looked at Mason with the particular attentiveness he had when something had happened that he knew about but had not been directly involved in. She left, Ethan said. She left. What did she want? Same as October, to buy the property. Ethan's expression didn't change much. And I told her no. Now the expression shifted. So what? I told her I wanted a partner instead of a buyer. Mason took the coffee from Ethan's hand without asking and drank some of it. She said she'd think about it. Ethan absorbed that. A partner. Revenue share. She brings capital and contracts. We keep ownership of the land. Ethan was quiet for a moment, working through it the way he worked through everything, methodically, from the inside out. Then he said, her trucks were 4 of the ones in the lot last night. Yes. So she saw what this place did last night? Yes. And that's why she came back? That's part of it, Mason said. The other part is that she's good at business, and she can see what this location becomes if it's properly capitalized. She said that? She said she was wrong about the property, and about me. Ethan turned that over. She actually said that. She did. His son looked at the gate where the Range Rover had been. Then he looked at his father with an expression that was hard to describe. Not quite pride, not quite surprise, something that had elements of both but was more specific than either. The look of someone who has been watching a difficult thing happen and has seen it turn in the direction they believed it would turn, and is registering not triumph, but a quiet, solid satisfaction. Okay, Ethan said. What do you need me to pull together? Full operational data, revenue breakdown by service type, weekly since opening, cost logs, service call records, the storage utilization numbers. Mason handed back the coffee cup. She wants it by tomorrow morning. Ethan nodded. I can have it by tonight. Don't kill yourself. I won't. He turned toward the trailer, then stopped. Dad? Yeah. The rumors from before the storm. He said it carefully. We're not going to just let that go. Mason looked at him. He'd been thinking about this in the hours since the storm had cleared, in the spaces between the truck departures and the account settlements and Ava Kensington's visit. The fact of what Derek had done, the careful, deniable, damaging thing, sat in him like a splinter, not acute, but present. No, he said, we're not going to let it go. What are you going to do? I'm going to call him, Mason said, and I'm going to tell him what I know, and then I'm going to tell him that it's done and it's not going to happen again. And if it does happen again, it won't. He said it with a flatness that wasn't anger. It was just certainty, the kind that came from knowing someone well enough to know where their limits were. Derek was calculating. A calculated person, once they understood the cost-benefit, had shifted permanently, adjusted. Ethan seemed to accept that. He went inside. Mason called Derek from the gate, standing where the Range Rover had been. Derek picked up on the third ring. His voice was the same careful, even tone it usually was. I've been meaning to call you back, the missed call yesterday. I know what you did, Mason said. Silence. Mason, I know how you did it too. The question about the insurance coverage. Carlos. The driver community on I-40 is smaller than you think, Derek, and people talk. He kept his voice level. Not because he wasn't angry. He was, specifically and clearly, in a way that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with the 17% revenue drop and the 4 drivers who'd reduced their usage, and Sandra at Mesa Run Logistics rerouting her people to Albuquerque. The rumors cost me about 4 weeks of momentum. Revenue, I'm not going to get back. More silence. Then, carefully, I don't know what you think. Derek. He said it the way you say a name when you want someone to stop. Just the name. A full stop. Derek stopped. I'm not going to do anything about it, Mason said. No lawyers, no confrontation, none of that. But I need you to understand something clearly. This property is not available to you in any form. Not as a partner, not as an advisor, not as a relative who drops by. You made a choice, and it wasn't a small one, and now the door is closed. Derek was quiet for long enough that Mason thought maybe the call had dropped. Then, I was trying to help you see. You were trying to push me towards selling because you thought you could work something with a buyer. I don't know exactly what, and I don't need to. I know why you did it, and I know what it cost me. He paused. We're family. That doesn't go away. But you don't get access to this business. Not now, not if it grows into something bigger. You made sure of that. He ended the call. He stood at the gate for a moment in the cold, looking down the access road where it met the state road, where beyond it was the interchange and the interstate and everything connected to everything else. His phone buzzed. A text from Derek. I'm sorry. 3 words. No punctuation after them, which was exactly the kind of apology Derek gave. Spare, deniable, technically complete. Mason looked at it, put the phone in his pocket. He went back to the shed and finished the hydraulic check on the lift. The afternoon passed in the way afternoons passed at the yard. Not quietly, never quite quietly, but in the particular rhythm they'd developed over 3 months. The flow of small tasks and decisions and driver interactions that had come to feel like the natural texture of the days. The remaining trucks in the lot cleared out by 3 p.m. Ethan had the operational data half-assembled by 4, working at the counter in the trailer on his laptop, cross-referencing the ledger entries against the digital logs he'd been keeping in parallel since the 5th week when he'd decided the paper system alone wasn't sufficient. A driver Mason didn't recognize came in at 4:30 needing a brake inspection before he could legally continue his route. He'd been stranded since the storm and needed certification before he could move. Mason did the inspection, checked everything, logged everything, found a minor wear issue on the front left that was within parameters but needed attention in the next service cycle, and told the driver so directly. "You're okay to continue," Mason said, "but get that front left looked at properly in the next 500 miles. "How bad is it?" "Not bad, but it'll be bad if you leave it another 5,000. The driver appreciated that. He said so. He asked about regular service rates, and Mason gave him the card. The same simple card he'd been handing out since the 2nd week. Nothing fancy, just the information. "I'm on the I-40 corridor 3 times a month," the driver said. "We're here," Mason said. After the driver left, Mason stood in the shed for a moment in the quiet. The lift was there, operational. The tool station Ethan had organized was there. The parts inventory from the school bus was there, cataloged and accessible. The rebuilt vehicles were outside. The lot was cleared and graveled and marked. The storage trailer was documented and functional. All of it built in 3 months. All of it built on $12 and a flatbed with a bad fuel system and a son who made lists and stayed until things were done. He was still a long way from settling the debt. He knew that. The bank payment structure gave him a path, but it was a long path, and now there was the possibility of something that could shorten it, or more accurately, something that could make it irrelevant by building the operation into something whose revenue made the original debt look like the relatively small number it was in the context of what this place could actually generate. But that was tomorrow's thinking, or the thinking of the meeting he'd have with Ava Kensington's attorneys. Tonight he had an operational data package to review and a ledger to update and a yard to secure before the temperature dropped again. He went back inside. Ethan looked up from the laptop when he came in. "Sandra from Mesa Run Logistics called the business line while you were in the shed," he said. Mason stopped. "What did she say?" "She heard about the storm response. She wants to reschedule the in-person visit she mentioned before." Ethan's face was carefully neutral, the way it was when he was waiting for Mason to register something. "She said one of her drivers was in the lot last night and called her this morning. The 17% drop, 4 weeks of lost momentum. Sandra rerouting her people to Albuquerque." "Okay," Mason said. "Schedule it." "Already did," Ethan said. "Next Tuesday." Mason looked at his son. 20 years old, sitting in a folding chair in a metal trailer in the high desert with grease on his neck and a laptop full of operational data and a schedule already managed. "You ate today?" Mason asked. Ethan looked at him. "Did you?" They looked at each other. "There's a diner in town," Mason said. "I know where the diner is." "Close this up. We'll finish the data package in the morning. She doesn't need it until tomorrow night." Ethan closed the laptop. He didn't argue about it, which told Mason he was more tired than he was letting on. They locked up the yard and got in the borrowed truck. They still didn't have a personal vehicle, had been sharing the borrowed truck from Carlos's brother for 2 months now, an arrangement that had extended itself with the particular formlessness of things that work through inertia, and drove toward town. The road was clear, the plows having been through twice since morning. The desert was white and flat in the headlights, the mountains dark against a sky that was finally, after 2 days of storm, beginning to show stars in the gaps between the clouds. They didn't talk much on the drive. They hadn't needed to talk much in a long time. The working relationship they'd built at the yard had its own communication system, compact and efficient, and the talking that happened in the truck, or at lunch or in the evenings, was the other kind, the kind that wasn't about logistics. "You think she'll actually do it?" Ethan said, about halfway to town. The partnership. "I think she's smart enough to see what it's worth," Mason said. "And she doesn't make decisions based on pride. She told me she was wrong, and people who can say that can usually recalibrate. You trust her? Mason thought about it. Not the theatrical version of thinking about it, just actually considering the question. I trust that she's rational and that her interests and ours would align in a partnership structure. That's different from trust in the personal sense. Is that enough? For business? Usually. Ethan nodded slowly, looking at the road. What about Derek? What about him? I mean, are you okay? Mason glanced at him. His son was looking straight ahead, asking the question the way he asked most things, directly, without building up to it, but with a gentleness underneath that he didn't always advertise. I'm okay, Mason said. He made a bad choice. It cost us. We got through it anyway. Does it... Ethan stopped, started again. Does it change things between you and him? Yes, Mason said. It changes some things. Ethan was quiet. He's still my brother, Mason said. But some things don't go back to how they were. That's just how it is. They pulled into the diner's parking lot, the neon sign buzzing in the cold, the windows steamed from the inside with the warmth of a place that had probably been busy all day with people coming in out of the storm aftermath. Mason turned off the truck. For a moment, they just sat there with the engine ticking down in the cold. Grandpa would have liked last night, Ethan said. Not the way he'd said it in the yard 2 months ago, with the particular gentleness of someone trying to offer something, just as a plain fact, offered plainly. Yeah, Mason said, he would have. They got out of the truck and went inside. The operational data package that Ethan finished at 7:30 the following morning was 11 pages long. Not because Ethan had padded it, the opposite, actually. He'd cut everything that wasn't essential, every number that didn't speak directly to what the operation was and what it could demonstrate about itself. Revenue by service category, weekly since day one. Cost breakdown. Utilization rates on the parking, the storage, the service bay. Service call volume and response times. A one-page summary of the storm response with the raw numbers. 22 vehicles, 11 shelter occupants, 4 road clearance assists, 14 logged service calls, 0 incidents, 0 freight losses. Mason read through it at the counter while his coffee went cold. This is good, he said. I know, Ethan said without arrogance, just accurately. Mason sent it to the email address on Ava Kensington's business card at 7:53 in the morning. He didn't add much in the body of the email. A few lines saying the data covered the full operational period, that he was available for questions, that he looked forward to the conversation. He didn't oversell it. The numbers did what numbers did when they were real, which was speak for themselves. Her response came back in 40 minutes. I'll have my attorney contact you this week to schedule a preliminary discussion. In the meantime, I have a question. The storm response. Who authorized the shelter configuration in the storage trailer? He wrote back. I did. Her reply. Did you have liability coverage for that use? He sat with that for a moment. Then he typed, No. I had people who needed to be warm. There was a longer pause this time, then. We'll need to address insurance structure as part of any partnership framework. Your instinct was right. The legal exposure needs to be managed going forward. He read that twice. Not the content. The content was straightforward, but the framing. Your instinct was right. From Ava Kensington, who had stood in this yard in October and told him the property had no future, that was not a small thing to write. He showed it to Ethan, who read it and handed the phone back and said, She's already thinking about going forward. That's what it sounds like. Good, Ethan said, and went back to what he was doing, which was rebuilding the carburetor on the second service truck they'd been working toward for the past month. Sandra from Mesa Run Logistics came on Tuesday as scheduled. She was a compact, efficient woman in her 50s who had been dispatching freight routes in the Southwest for 20 years and had the particular directness of someone who had spent decades cutting through noise to find the operational truth of situations. She walked the property with Mason for 40 minutes, asked questions that were specific and practical. Storage capacity, service turnaround times, emergency response protocols, the coverage radius of the recovery trucks. And when she was done, she stood at the entrance to the service shed and looked at the lift and the tool station and the parts inventory visible through the school bus door. You built all of this in 3 months, she said. It wasn't a question. My son and I, Mason said, and some help from a mechanic friend early on. She looked at Ethan, who was across the yard doing a pre-service check on the flatbed. Ethan glanced up, registered her look, gave a brief nod, and went back to the checklist. How old is he? Sandra asked. 20? She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite surprise. Something in between. I've got dispatchers who've been doing this for 10 years who don't run checklists without being told. He learned it from having to, Mason said, which is probably the only way anyone really learns it. Sandra nodded. She had her hands in her coat pockets and she was still looking at the yard, at the organized whole of it, the function that had accumulated over 3 months of work that hadn't been clean or straightforward or anything close to easy. I'm going to be direct with you, she said. Please. I pulled back because of the rumors. I want to acknowledge that because I think it's important that you know I made a reactive decision without verifying the facts first. She said it without excessive self-flagellation, just honest accounting. In this industry, reputation is currency, and a concern about freight integrity is something I can't ignore, but I should have called you directly before rerouting. I appreciate you saying that, Mason said. I'm also going to say that the storm response changed the calculus for me significantly. I've got a driver who was in that lot. He's been with me for 8 years. He doesn't say much about anything, and he called me the morning after and told me that what you ran here that night was the most professionally managed emergency situation he'd seen in his time on I-40. That's not nothing. It was a long night, Mason said. We did what needed doing. That's exactly what he said, Sandra told him, almost word for word. She turned and looked at him directly. I want to set up a formal service agreement, preferred vendor status for Mesa Run drivers on this corridor. Parking, storage, emergency service priority. Mason kept his face steady. I'd want to talk through the terms. Of course. I'll have something drafted and we can negotiate from there. She extended her hand. Is that a starting point? He shook it. That's a starting point. After Sandra left, Mason went and found Ethan under the flatbed. Mesa Run wants a preferred vendor agreement, he said to the underside of the truck. There was a pause. Then Ethan slid out on the creeper board and looked up at him. Formal contract? She's drafting terms. Ethan stared at the sky for a moment, or the underside of the flatbed, which was currently his sky. Then he said, We're going to need a second storage unit. I know. And another service vehicle. I know that too. Ethan sat up on the creeper board. The partnership with Kensington has to move, Mason said. Yeah. They looked at each other, and in that look was the entire calculation. The thing they'd been managing in 2 directions simultaneously, the organic growth that was arriving faster than their current capacity could cleanly absorb, and the capital partnership that could resolve that constraint, but was still in the preliminary conversation stage. How fast can you get me a meeting? Ethan asked. With Kensington's attorney? With Kensington herself, Ethan said. Attorneys draft what they're told to draft. The decisions get made before that. Mason looked at his son. There were times, not frequent, but distinct, when Ethan said something that reminded Mason viscerally of his own father, not in tone, not in manner, just in the particular quality of the insight. The old man had had a way of cutting directly to the operative fact of a situation, bypassing the surrounding noise, arriving at the thing that actually mattered. I'll call her today, Mason said. He called her that afternoon. She picked up herself, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected an assistant, a scheduling system, some layer of professional distance. Instead, she picked up on the second ring and said, I was going to call you tomorrow. Mesa Run Logistics wants a preferred vendor agreement, he said. Formal contract. It's going to require expansion of storage capacity and potentially another service vehicle. A brief silence. He could almost hear her adjusting, the way she had in October when he'd answered her offer with a question she hadn't expected. How soon do they want to move? She asked. She's drafting terms now. I'd guess 2 weeks to a signed agreement. And you need capital for the expansion before you can commit to fulfilling the agreement. Yes. Which means the partnership conversation needs to accelerate. Yes, he said again. Another brief pause, not hesitation, calculation. Can you come to Albuquerque? I'd rather do this in person. When? Thursday, she said. I'll be there Thursday, he said. He drove to Albuquerque on Thursday morning in the borrowed truck, which he was increasingly aware was a logistical liability. They needed a vehicle that wasn't on indefinite loan from Carlos's brother. They needed several things that required money they didn't currently have, and the meeting he was driving to was precisely about resolving that constraint. Kensington Freight and Logistics occupied a full floor of a glass and concrete building near the Interstate Interchange in Albuquerque, the kind of office that communicated operational seriousness without being ostentatious about it. Clean lines, functional layout, a reception area that was professional without being decorative. The woman at the front desk knew his name when he walked in, which meant Ava had told someone to expect him, which meant she'd been thinking about this meeting before he'd arrived. She met him herself, in a conference room with a view of the Sandia Mountains going orange in the morning light. There was coffee on the table, a legal pad, and a single folder. No team of attorneys, no audience. Just her. I want to understand something before we talk numbers, she said, after they'd sat down. The Mesa Run agreement. What does full fulfillment of that contract require? He told her. Storage expansion. A second trailer unit, properly fitted and certified. A third service vehicle to handle the increased call volume that would come with preferred vendor status for a carrier Mesa Run size. Improved documentation systems. Potentially a part-time hire for overnight coverage, because right now the after-hours response was Mason and Ethan, and there was a ceiling to what two people could absorb. She listened without writing anything down, which meant she was either not detail-oriented, which everything he knew about her contradicted, or she was listening at a level that didn't require notes yet. What does that cost? She asked when he finished. He gave her the number he and Ethan had worked out. It was not a small number. It was not an unreasonable number either, given what it would enable. She didn't flinch at it, which he'd expected, but she also didn't immediately agree to it, which he'd also expected. Here's what I want, she said, and I want to be direct about it the way you've been direct with me. She folded her hands on the table. I want priority access to the facility for Kensington Fleet vehicles. Not exclusive. I understand the community value of an open operation, and I'm not trying to change that, but guaranteed response times and dedicated storage allocation. Defined in the agreement, Mason said. Yes. I also want input on expansion decisions that affect capacity available to my fleet. Not control. Input. Define process for that, he said. Consultation before major capacity changes. Revenue share structured around utilization. Not a flat percentage of overall revenue, but a return tied to the value the facility generates for Kensington operations specifically. That's going to require some creative structuring, Mason said. My attorney is good at creative structuring, she said. The principle is that my return should be tied to what I actually get out of this, not just to the fact that I put capital in. I can work with that principle, he said. And she paused, just briefly. Equity. Not majority, not controlling, but I want a stake in the property itself, not just in the operating revenue. This was the part he'd known was coming, the part he'd thought about most carefully in the days since the storm. He'd built this position from nothing, from $12 and a bad fuel system and a son who stayed until things were done. The land had been his father's and was now his, and the idea of giving any portion of it away had sat in him since October, like something to be defended at all costs. But he'd also spent 3 months building an operation that was bumping against the ceiling of what he and Ethan could grow it without capital. And the honest truth, which he had arrived at somewhere in the long arithmetic of recent weeks, was that owning 100% of something limited was not the same as owning a smaller percentage of something that could actually become what it was capable of being. His father had understood that too, he thought. The old man had spent 30 years on the property, grinding, building, running out of time. He hadn't run out of vision, he'd run out of resources. If someone had offered him a partnership that could have finished what he was building, Mason thought he knew what his father would have said. He would have said, define the terms clearly and shake the hand. 20%? Mason said. Non-controlling? No right of first refusal on a future sale without a 60-day negotiation period. and Ethan's operational role is defined in the agreement as permanent. His position isn't subject to partner review. Ava looked at him for a moment. 20% is below what I'd normally take for this level of capital input. It's what's available, Mason said. The operation is mine and Ethan's. You're buying into what it can become, not what it is. She looked at the folder on the table, opened it. Inside was a document. She'd had something drafted already, Mason could see, a preliminary term sheet. She'd come to this meeting prepared to make a deal. 22, she said, and I want board observation rights, Bo. No voting, just the right to be informed of major strategic decisions. 22 with observation rights, Mason said, and Ethan's role in the agreement. Ethan's role in the agreement, she confirmed. They looked at each other across the table with the Sandia Mountains going full orange behind her and the folder open between them. We'll need attorneys to formalize this, she said. I know. This is a handshake on principles. I understand. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it. The attorneys took 6 weeks. There were moments in those 6 weeks when Mason thought the whole thing would collapse on a clause, because that was what attorneys did. They found the clauses, the ambiguities, the places where two parties had shaken hands on a principle without fully defining what the principle meant in practice. There was a week in January when the revenue share calculation became the subject of 3 separate conference calls and a 12-page exchange of proposed language that Ethan read through completely and then summarized for Mason in 4 sentences, which was the most useful thing anyone did that week. But it held. The principle held, and the attorneys found language for it. And on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, Mason signed his name to a partnership agreement at a table in the same Albuquerque conference room where he and Ava had shaken hands. Ethan was there. Ava was there. Ava's attorney was there, and Linda Cho was there. Mason had asked her to review everything, and she'd spent 2 evenings going through the full document, and her summary had been, "It's fair." She drove a harder initial position than what ended up in here. You negotiated well. Mason hadn't told her that most of the negotiating had been done by Ethan in the written exchanges, because Ethan had a precise and patient way of responding to proposed language that ground down ambiguity without creating antagonism. He'd mentioned it to Ethan afterward, and Ethan had shrugged and said, "Attorneys write in circles, you just have to be more patient than they are." After the signing, in the parking garage while they waited for the elevator, Linda said to Mason, "You know this changes things operationally. She's going to be a real partner. She's going to have opinions." "I know," Mason said. "You're okay with that?" "She's earned it," he said. "She saw what the place could be before I gave her any reason to trust it." "She saw it after the storm," Linda said. "She saw it after the storm," he agreed. "But she came back and she said she was wrong. That counts for something." The capital came through in tranches, starting in February, and the expansion moved with a speed that was startling after months of grinding on limited resources. The second storage unit, a proper refrigerated trailer this time, certified and insured, with documentation systems that met commercial freight standards, was operational by the end of February. The third service vehicle, a heavy-duty wrecker that Mason had identified at a fleet auction in Phoenix and that Ethan had personally flown down to inspect before bidding, was in the yard and running by mid-March. The part-time overnight hire was a man named Ray, 53 years old, retired from a trucking career that had ended with a knee that didn't allow the long-haul hours anymore. He knew vehicles, he knew drivers, and he had the particular patience of someone who had spent decades doing a job that required waiting and readiness in equal measure. He showed up for his first shift, walked the property for 2 hours asking questions, and at the end of it told Mason, "I'll be back tomorrow." "Good," Mason said. "The kid runs a tight operation," Ray said, nodding toward the shed where Ethan was. "The kid's my son," Mason said. "I know," Ray said. "That's what I said." The Mesa Run Preferred Vendor Agreement was signed in March. 2 other carriers followed in April, smaller than Mesa Run but consistent, their dispatchers having heard about the operation from drivers who'd been through during or after the storm. By May, the parking lot was running at capacity on weekday nights, and Mason was having a conversation with Ava. They'd developed a rhythm of twice-monthly calls to discuss operational matters, direct and efficient, the way both of them preferred things, about the possibility of expanding the lot footprint into the adjacent land. "The parcel to the north," Ava said. "Have you looked at it?" It's in probate, Mason said. Has been for 2 years. I've talked to the county. It's going to clear sometime this summer. When it clears, I want to move on it. So do I. It was that kind of partnership. Not frictionless. There were disagreements, and some of them were real ones. Not just differences in style, but differences in what each of them thought the operation should prioritize. Ava had a pull toward the largest freight accounts, the highest volume contracts, the strategic relationships that scaled fastest. Mason had a pull toward the drivers themselves, the individual relationships, the smaller operators who relied on the yard the way Terry had relied on it from the beginning. They argued about this directly and without resolution on 2 separate calls. And after the second one, Ethan, who'd been listening from across the trailer, said, "You're both right. You're just optimizing for different time horizons." Mason looked at him. "What does that mean?" "She's optimizing for where the business is in 3 years. You're optimizing for why it works right now. The answer is you need both." He went back to his laptop. "I could write that up if you want to send it to her." Mason told Ava what Ethan had said on the next call. There was a pause, and then she said, "Your son is right," and they moved on. There was a morning in June, the first week of June, the air already carrying the particular warmth that preceded the summer heat in the high desert, when Mason was at the property early, the way he always was, and he was standing at the front gate the way he'd stood at the front gate on the first day, looking at what was there. The parking lot was bigger now, its edges extended twice since November, the gravel surface solid and marked with the painted lines Ethan had laid out in April. The equipment shed had its full roof and new lighting, and the lift that ran quietly and reliably and had turned a 4-bay service concept into a reality that kept a backlog of appointments 3 days out. The storage units, 2 of them now, both certified, both logged, were generating more consistent revenue than anything else on the property. The school bus still stood in the back corner, the parts shelves still inside it, though they'd built a proper parts room in an extension off the equipment shed, and most of the inventory had migrated there. They'd left the bus where it was. Neither of them had talked about why. It just stayed. The operation employed 4 people now: Mason, Ethan, Ray on overnight, and a part-time bookkeeper that Linda had recommended. A woman named Grace, who came in 3 mornings a week and kept the accounting current in a way that no longer required Mason to do ledger math at midnight. The borrowed truck from Carlos's brother had gone back months ago. They had 2 vehicles, a proper work truck that Mason drove, and a smaller pickup that Ethan used for parts runs and city errands. The debt was not gone, but it was reduced. The restructured payment plan had been running 8 months, every payment made, and at the current revenue trajectory, which Linda had modeled carefully with appropriate caution, the underlying obligation would be resolved within 14 months. Not erased exactly, but resolved, paid, finished. Mason was thinking about all of this, standing at the gate in the early morning, when he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him, and Ethan came and stood beside him. They stood there together the way they'd stood at things throughout this whole process, side by side, not quite facing each other, both looking at the same thing. "Ray's already here," Ethan said. "He got in early." "He does that." "I know." Ethan had his hands in his jacket pockets. "Grace called yesterday. She wants to talk about the accounting software. She says what we're using is going to create problems when the volume gets larger." "Schedule it." I did. The sun was coming up behind them, the light moving across the yard slowly, catching the clean lines of the storage units and the gravel lot and the painted lines and the sign at the gate. The sign was the same hand-lettered one from the storm. Mason had replaced it twice as the weather wore it down, but kept the same text each time. "Open during storm, emergency shelter available. Call the number." He'd thought about making a proper sign, something printed, more professional. He'd kept the hand-lettered one. "I talked to Linda yesterday," Mason said. "About?" "The numbers, the projection." He paused. "She thinks we clear the debt in 14 months if the trajectory holds." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "If it holds." "If it holds." "It's going to hold," Ethan said. Not with bravado, just the flat certainty of someone who'd been watching the numbers long enough to understand their direction. Mason didn't answer that. Not because he disagreed, but because some things were better held than said. There was something Mason had been thinking about since January, since the signing, since the operation had crossed the line from survival into something that was clearly and demonstrably working. He'd been thinking about what it meant, and whether the meaning was the kind of thing that could be articulated or whether it was just a thing you carried. He'd grown up watching his father work, not in the romantic way of stories about fathers and sons, but in the actual way. The grease, the cold mornings, the problems that didn't resolve cleanly, the times the equipment failed and the money ran short, and the old man kept going anyway. Not because he was exceptional, but because stopping wasn't something he knew how to do. His father had been a stubborn, impractical, deeply competent man who had spent his life building something that hadn't finished building before he ran out of time. What Mason had come to understand in the months since the rain-soaked afternoon when he'd first walked through this gate and found the started gravel and the organized parts in the school bus and the graded ground waiting for its purpose. What he'd come to understand was that his father hadn't failed. His father had simply done his portion of the work and left the rest for whoever came next. That was the inheritance everyone had called a mistake. Not the debt, not the rusted trucks, not the unfinished lot. The portion of work that was left undone. Mason had come to finish it, and Ethan would carry whatever came next. He thought about Ava Kensington standing in this yard in October, telling him the property had no future, and the way he'd looked at her and kept the card and kept thinking. He didn't hold it against her. She'd seen what the data showed, which was the rational thing to see. What she hadn't been able to see was the thing that wasn't in the data, what a person would do when the rational option was to walk away and they chose not to. That wasn't a knock on her. Most people couldn't see that. Most people, including Mason himself, hadn't known he was the kind of person who would make that choice until the choice was in front of him. He thought about Derek. He still thought about Derek sometimes, in the particular unresolved way that family stays unresolved even after you've closed a door. Derek had called twice since November. Mason had taken the calls, kept them short and civil. They were brothers, and that was a fact that wouldn't change, and the other fact, what Derek had done, the careful damage of it, was also a fact that wouldn't change. Both things existed. Mason had found a way to carry both without letting either one cost him more than it already had. He thought about Ethan, 20 years old when they'd started this. 21 now, and changed, not dramatically, not in any way that made him a different person, but changed the way people change when they've done hard things and come through them and know what they're actually capable of. He moved through the yard with a confidence that wasn't arrogance, an ownership over the operation that wasn't about possession, but about competence. He knew every system, every vehicle, every contract, every driver by name. He knew the business the way you know something you built yourself. Mason had been terrified in the early weeks that he was pulling his son into something that would fail and leave Ethan with nothing but the cost of having tried. That fear had never entirely gone away. It had just been outpaced, gradually, by evidence. "Hey," Ethan said. He was looking at the access road where a truck was slowing at the junction, its signal blinking for the turn into the yard. An early arrival, someone needing service before the road got busy. "Yeah," Mason said. "We should go." "Yeah," he said again. "We should." They walked back across the yard together, the gravel solid under their boots, the shed door open, and the light on inside where Ray had already started the morning checks. The truck was coming through the gate, the driver leaning out the window to get his bearings, and Mason raised a hand to direct him toward the service bay, and the driver nodded and swung the rig around with the particular competence of someone who spent their life putting large vehicles into small spaces. The sun was fully up now. The desert stretched out flat and clear in every direction, the mountains to the east catching the early light, the air still carrying the edge of cool that would burn off by mid-morning and leave the day clear and hot and long. 4 acres of hard work and stubbornness and his father's unfinished business. A sign at the gate that said they'd be open in the storm. A son who made lists and stayed until things were done. And the thing nobody had been able to see in October, when the debt was fresh, and the trucks were rusted, and a woman in a wool coat had stood in this yard and done the math, and arrived at the wrong answer. The thing that had always been here, underneath all of it, waiting for someone to come back and finish the work. It wasn't the land, it wasn't the location, it wasn't even what the yard had become. It was the decision to stay when every reasonable voice said go, and you couldn't put that in a ledger, and you couldn't model it in a projection, And it wasn't the kind of thing that showed up in an operational data package, but it was the only reason any of it existed. Mason went to work.